All right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is the regular June meeting of the Blaine County School District number 61 Board of Trustees, and also the annual budget hearing. Let's begin, if we could, Madam Clerk, by having you call roll of the 4 trustees who have already been sworn in.
Trustee Green?
Present.
Trustee Lorna?
Present.
Trustee Stone?
Present.
And Trustee Rourke?
Present. The quorum now exists, and I declare so. We are going to move item C under public hearing up to item B so that we can get our newest trustee sworn in and participating. Madam Clerk, if you would administer the oath of office, please.
All right. Dan, if you could please raise your right hand and repeat after me.
Unmute your mic, please, though.
Okay. I, Daniel Turner, do affirm
I, Daniel Turner, do affirm
that I will support the Constitution of the United States,
that I will support the Constitution of the United States,
the Constitution and laws of this state,
the Constitution and laws of this state,
and that I will faithfully discharge
and that I will faithfully discharge
all the duties of the office of trustee of Blaine County School District number 61
all the duties of the office of trustee of Blaine County School District number 61
in Blaine County, state of Idaho,
in Blaine County, state of Idaho,
according to the best of my ability.
according to the best of my abilities.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Hey, welcome.
Yeah. Welcome, Dan. Next item is the approval of the agenda. Have all members of the board received the agenda for tonight's meeting?
Yes.
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 Are there any questions or amendments for that agenda? All right, do I have a motion then to approve the agenda as printed?
I move we approve the agenda.
A second, or was that a simultaneous motion and second?
The joys of
All right, any discussion? Hearing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor of approving tonight's agenda will signify by saying aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
And those opposed, there are no opposed votes. Therefore, the measure passes. Chair votes with the ayes. This is the time and place set aside for the annual state mandated public hearing on the proposed budget for fiscal year 2021. Here is how I propose to proceed. I'm going to ask Brian to give us an overview, to go through the budget, give us a presentation. Then we will open up for questioning. What I would like to do is begin with Vice Chair Green, and then we will go to Trustee Stone, then to Trustee Lorna, then to our newest member, Trustee Turner, and I will follow. So, Brian, are you ready?
I'm ready.
The floor is yours.
Chairman, trustees, thank you very much. You review the material tonight, and some of it is, I'll say, repetitive or duplicative from our May special meeting, and much of the material is in the budget book that was posted last week. There is some unique or new material, and in addition to that, there will be some items that I won't go through in the same grade or the same level of depth as we discussed in our May meeting. Just because there's so much material here to cover. Our May meeting really focused primarily on the general fund and to a far lesser degree, the plant facilities fund, so that we could focus on the 2 largest funds associated with the district budget. But tonight we'll be covering a whole host of funds. So with that, I'll go ahead and jump into the presentation. Can everybody see that, the cover page on the screen?
No, as a matter of fact.
You can.
Who's supposed to share that? Is it Vicky or you?
Yep.
Hey, Brian, when you go down at the bottom and you have your controls, there's a little box with an arrow that says share content, and that should allow you to share your screen.
Okay. How's that?
Great.
Yep.
There we go.
All right, we're in business. Okay, so this is material that was actually in the budget book. So when you see the, make sure I have the right thing here. I do not have the right thing. Hold that thought. Okay, let me take two on this. Can you guys see that?
Well, I can see a herringbone pattern, but that's about it.
If you try and share it again, it'll work. I think you shared just the one document, not your whole screen. And so when you change documents, it wasn't displaying anymore.
Okay, let me give it a go again here. How's that?
Great.
Okay. So, apologize, the previous material that we were looking at was actually the budget book material. So what we're going to do is jump into the material that is part of the presentation tonight. And thought we'd start with the budget timeline, just to remind folks, particularly our viewers, the material that, the process, the material that we have previously reviewed. I'm not going to go in great depth in this, but our process started back in January, where the budget guidelines were defined by the Board of Trustees to help guide us in the directions in which we would then formulate the budget. In February, we talked about early allocation formula, conducted a review. In March, we talked about birth rate model and enrollment. April, we started to take a larger look at the various moving pieces in the budget that actually are drivers. Also looked at some planned facilities fund items, such as our overview of debt. May's where we really looked at a greater detailed look of the general fund in regards to a top-down look at revenues and expenses. And then here we are tonight with our June budget hearing. In the budget book, I have a page for the budget strategy. I'm not going to read this, but essentially the overview of the budget strategy that was set in place a couple years ago was that with the passage of the supplemental levy, and that was a 2-year supplemental levy, which ran in the school years of 1819 and 1920, and then expired at the end of 1920. So this being the 1920 school year, we'll see that supplemental, and concurrently, the planned facilities both expire now at the end of this year. But that we would take those supplemental levy dollars and, along with our regular revenues, try to set aside as much money as possible to augment the reserves in the general fund, and then use those dollars in 2021, 22 to use those saved reserves to fill in the gap between revenues and expenses as the district transitioned either to a smaller expense footprint and or an additional revenue source in the form of perhaps another supplemental levy. So here we are in 2021, and part of that strategy we now see will go into place in regards to drawing down on some of those general fund reserves to fill the difference between our revenues and our expenses. Just a quick overview of the governor's holdback. The holdback that was announced in a memo released on the 8th, and this is I believe it's Appendix F in the budget book for those who might be interested in taking a look at what that actually, what the material was actually is presented. But essentially, there was some freezing of items that were supposed to increase from the current year into next year. So those freezes meant that the increases did not take place, and then there were some actual reductions. So they suspended or froze the 2% base salary increases in the funding formula for administrators and classified salary. So that's not an actual cut to our 2021 year, but it is a lack of an increase, freezing the movement on instructional and pupil staff on the career ladder. So if you were on step 3 on the career ladder, you stay on step 3 next year instead of taking that next step down to step 4. Suspending leadership premium for this district, we received leadership premium about $299,000, $300,000. They're suspending that, so that is a legitimate cut. They've reduced the professional development line item by about 45%. They've reduced the IT staffing by about 50%. They reduced classroom technology line item by about 27%. And they reduced the content and curriculum line item by about 25%. And finally, one of the mechanisms in the funding formula that was an actual cut, again, was a 3% factor for what they call the discretionary line item. And those are monies that are not directly attached to a staff member, such as a classified, certified, or administrator, but instead is used to pay for the discretionary aspects that don't feel very discretionary in the general fund, such as paying utilities, paying for benefits, paying for supplies, things of that nature. And finally, as a follow-up, the State Department of Education had provided additional or further guidance in which they said the content and curriculum would not be a 25% cut, but would actually be cut in full, and that gate funding would not be provided next year. The good news is gate funding is only about $11,000 of our funding, so it's not a big hit to us. And we have no staff that are attached to that. We have to use that for professional development, supplies, things of that nature. So graduating from how those budget holdbacks, and it was announced as a 5% holdback, and for the district, Blaine County School District, it's roughly a 5% holdback if you look at where we would have otherwise been relative to the funding that will come through next year. So when we look at this particular graph here, or this chart, what we have is a list of our general fund revenues, including our carryovers. And the carryovers are not new funds, and they're listed here in the gray area at the bottom of this list of revenue sources. Carryovers are funds that we have received in previous years, or revenues that we received in previous years, where our revenues exceeded the amount that we spent. So we were able to save those dollars, and we are able to use those as carryover, or in this particular case, funds that will fill the difference between our revenues that we anticipate receiving and the expenses that we project spending. So the blue area is our local revenue sources. The green area are miscellaneous local. So the blue is really, if you think about local property taxes, is probably the best way to describe that. This gold area here in the middle is the funding that comes from the state. And as I just mentioned, the gray area are previously saved revenues that are in a reserve that we're now drawing down for the 2021 year. A couple of things that are worth mentioning. The delta, or the difference between the current year budgeted amount and the 2021 budgeted amount, are listed in this column F. And you can see that they accumulate to $6.3 million, the difference between our current year and next year. And a couple of the drivers behind that, the big pieces behind it, is this almost $3 million 2-year supplemental levy that we talked about earlier that was going to expire. And so when it comes off the roll, we'll lose that roughly $3 million. And then in addition, with state support, we are actually seeing a reduction and projecting a reduction in the number of students next year. This has nothing to do with COVID-19. It just simply has to do with smaller kindergarten cohorts that have been arriving and moving through our system and replacing larger senior or 12th grade cohorts that are graduating. So we're actually seeing a reduction in our overall student count, and that has been taking place for a period of time. So collectively, between the loss of students and then the 5% reduction from the state, and then what we've done is taken a very conservative approach and made the assumption we're going to lose some additional funding because the loss of attendance or students next year will actually result in a further reduction than the original 51 students that we had projected losing as associated with just those smaller cohorts. So when we take all that into consideration, it's actually about a $4.8 million drop. So when we interject the carryover differences, our contingency reserve, and just to help folks understand, when we look at the expense size, we'll have a contingency reserve of $2.5 million. And what that serves as a cushion between the amount of money that the board would otherwise allocate and approve for expenses in the event that we overexpend. Next year might be a good example of that in regards to we may have more costs associated with dealing with COVID-19. We may have a very active snow year in which we're dealing with snow removal costs that exceed what we originally project. We may end up with a very cold season. Maybe it's dry, but it's very cold. And so our utility costs end up being higher than it might otherwise be in a normal year. So that cushion exists to allow us to, even though it is not what our plan or our intention is, but it does allow us that cushion to spend beyond what we would have normally spent and not exceed the statutory limit in which the state only allows, or the statute only allows for a district to spend. So we cannot spend next year more than $57,088,032, because that's the maximum amount that the board will, assuming under these parameters, that this is what the board approves tonight, that would be the maximum amount. But 2.5 of that is a cushion associated with the contingency fund. Now to balance that, I have a contingency fund, I'll call it a revenue line item. The true nature of it is it's not new revenue. What it is it's money that we have saved and we're pulling from the reserve. Now, we can only, by statute, appropriate a maximum of 5%. So since we're losing funds above in those other categories, we actually have fewer reserves. So our maximum contingency can only be about $2.5 million. So that's where that $200,000 difference that you see there, where that's derived from. In addition, for our current year, we put on budget $5 million to transfer, should the board choose to do so, that $5 million out of the general fund and into the financial emergency reserve. We'll talk about that reserve in just a few minutes. The board had no obligation to do that, and in fact chose and opted not to do that. However, that is a line item that was in the budget for our current year that, as you can see, reflects a zero amount for next year. And when we get to the expenses, when we look at the amount of revenue that's coming in, new revenue, versus the amount of expenses that we're looking to spend, we will actually have a planned drawdown from the general fund reserves of about $3.7 million. Now, this goes along with what we talked about as our strategy just a few minutes ago in regards to collecting money, particularly in the 18-19, 19-20 year, and then saving those dollars for use in the 2021 year. So when we take a look at that collective entire amount, it comes up to $57,088,032, and that is not by happen chance the amount of expenses in total and general fund that we will be asking the board to approve for us to have as a budget for the 2021 year. So when we look at the total sums in regards to bulking these things together, you can see the local property taxes of 1920 and 2021 all totaled up into carryover. Carryover is again going back to this gray area. That is previous reserves that we've saved from previous year's revenues. Local property taxes dropping by the roughly $3 million associated with the supplemental levy expiring. Local sources are pretty flat. And then state revenue, you see that drop associated with the three things we talked about: smaller class sizes, or smaller student cohorts coming into our system versus the ones that are graduating, 5% holdback from the state of Idaho, and then a reduction in what we anticipate for attendance in a normal year, and possibly enrollment to as a driver behind the COVID-19 situation that could take place in fall. So again, we're trying to take a conservative approach to the revenues that we will receive from the state next year. And so I've just summed these up here. Just you'll find this in the budget book. I've just summed that up in regards to the largest contributors to the reduced revenue. And the items that are maintained, there's actually very little that's the same next year. Even when we look at carryover, we have the drawdown, and then that $5 million that we budgeted for current year that is not on budget this year for transfer to the financial emergency reserve. Really, the only thing that's pretty similar is this other local sources revenue, and it's such a small percent. It's really less than 1% of our overall budget, so it doesn't move the needle in any consequential way. So when we graph that and we take a look at the information, you can see that our yellow area in this pie chart is the funding that we receive from the state. We talked about what that looks like in regards to reduced funding. It represents about 32% of our funding for next year. And the orange part is the local property taxes. The blue part, which is normally around 5%, is actually at 11%. And the reason because we have that drawdown from the general fund reserve. And as you can see, the other local sources is just that 1%. Typically, you see this orange area closer to 60%, with the blue area closer to 5%, and the gold closer to 34%. But certainly, we've had a shift in the way that in sources of funding and revenue, and so we're seeing something a little different this year relative to previous years. So I'm going to graduate from the revenues conversation and talk a little bit about our reserves. The district currently has two reserve funds that, well, one is labeled the general fund reserve. That amount is $12.5 million as a round number. We also have the financial emergency reserve, and that's about $3.6 million. Again, these are round numbers. And the amount of 12.5 will either increase or decrease predicated upon the difference in revenues and expenses in the current 19-20 year. And we won't know that number until the end of July when we receive our final property tax payment. So at this particular point, particularly given the unknowns or uncertainties about how people are paying their property taxes, until that materializes, it's really difficult in any given year to really kind of nail that number. But given the uncertainties with COVID-19 and how people are addressing their property taxes, it's a real, let's just say the variability has the potential to be considerably higher than it would be in a normal year. That doesn't mean that we won't ultimately receive those funds. We just may not receive them in July of 2020. We may receive those in 2021 or in 2022. So it isn't that this is lost revenue, it's just deferred revenue. So we do anticipate seeing this blue $12.5 million increase associated with the difference or the carryover between for our current year into next year. But this blue source is where we're talking about these revenue sums that we had discussed in regards to this gray area. That's the source of funding that we're referencing when we start talking about the contingency fund carryover revenue and then the drawdown from the general fund reserves. Both of those are actually coming from this blue category, this blue area of money. If we look at a second photo of the reserve and we break down that blue area just a little further, it has a current balance of $12.5 million. Again, that's rounded dollars. And as we have it budgeted, we have 3.7 that is actually a part of the anticipated funding that we will draw down. So the expectation of 3.7 is that if everything went exactly as planned, we would draw down 3.7. If things go better, we'll draw down less. And that is always our goal, is to project, I don't want to say a worst case scenario, but certainly a conservative scenario so that we can draw down less than we originally projected. And then with the yellow here, I'm sorry, that's probably on my screen it looks more yellow. On your screen it might look a little more red. The $2.5 million that we're using, again, from the blue area to cover the contingency reserve. The difference between the 3.7 and the 2.5 is the 3.7 is on budget to be spent. The 2.5 is on budget to serve as a contingency and not to be spent. It'll provide us that cushion in the event that we have a bad year and the expenses move against us. But the idea is that next year, at the end of this next year, we will have spent none of those funds, and they will be still a portion of this 12.5 million. But if we take a look at this graph next to it here, you'll see how I've broken those three pieces up. So this is representative, these three colors are representative of this 12.5 million. But you can see the 3.7 million, and I apologize that the formatting of my numbers seems to have gotten a little squirrely on me here. But that blue area is representative of this 3.7 million. This reddish area is representative of the 2.5 funds to cover the contingency reserve, leaving a balance of roughly 6.29647. And if that gray area is the part that's off balance sheet, it's off budget, and it would be considered unappropriated. So when we talk about what's on budget, it's the blue and the red, and off budget would be the gray area.
Hey, Brian, can I ask a question?
Sure.
When we were doing negotiations, we were estimating about a $1.8 million rollover. Do you have an updated number for that?
At present, my number is still focused at 1.8.
Okay, and that would increase the general fund reserve total by an additional 1.8.
Yeah, let's just say it was, for convenience, it was 2 million. So instead of 1.8, let's say it's 2 million. This 12.5 would actually augment to then 14.5.
Right.
So yeah, my number hasn't really altered in any way. I think the biggest sway will be that July property tax payment. We also have a payment from the state of Idaho in July. It moves the needle a little bit, but it's not, it tends to move the needle a little bit here or there in any given year. But I think it's really when you start talking about the multiple millions that we're apt to receive in regards to our July property tax payment, that's where the real needle mover is.
Okay, thank you.
Certainly.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, go ahead.
Is it appropriate to ask questions during the narrative, or would you prefer we hold them all to the very end? My fear is that the narrative will go on, and I'll forget the question I wanted to ask before I won't get to the end. So I was wondering if what you felt about the questioning during the narrative.
No, we can go ahead and ask those questions now, and then we'll get into the detail. I would ask you to hold your questions until we're done with the detail, but go ahead now as long as we're in the narrative.
Yeah, again, this being my first rodeo, I'll have probably more questions than most. But when I look at the general fund total reserve, this balance of 12.5, it obviously came from somewhere. It's been described as savings over past years. It seems to me a large portion of that is an unspent plant and facilities levy that was. And what is the appropriateness of using money that we ask the taxpayers for a plant and facilities levy when it's not used is it then just journaled over to the general reserve fund that can be used for anything that is covered by general reserve funds? Or so how does this money grow to 12.5? How do we know it's not plant and facility levies that we didn't spend that now have morphed into something else?
So that's a great question, because I imagine that there's probably a lot of people that are watching that have the same question. And as we track these funds, the general fund is not to get into the nomenclature of it, but we track the general fund separately than we do from the plant facilities. So the revenues that come in for the plant facilities, we post into the plant facilities fund, and then all expenditures associated with it are written out of or coded against that plant facilities fund. Conversely, for the general fund, funding that comes from the state or the supplemental levy or the stabilization levy, those local property taxes that are supposed to be associated with the general fund, that's where we post that in the general fund. And just for those accounting people out there, the general fund has an account code of 100, whereas the plant facilities has account code of 420. So anytime you're looking at our ledger in regards to the coding and you see a 420, that's associated with the plant facilities, and a 100 is associated with the general fund. So the funds that you see all as noted here in this blue circle, this 12.5, those are strictly general fund dollars, and they are not inclusive of any federal dollars any state miscellaneous dollars from like driver's ed or career technical, and they're not inclusive of the plant facilities. And a little bit later on, when we get a little further in here, we'll talk about the funds that we have in the plant facility. And that's actually, if we were to draw, if we look back at this reserve and we talked about the
Brian, I think we've lost you.
What was it?
tracking those dollars separately.
And we had a levy a couple years ago that where voters agreed that we would switch part of what was a plant facilities levy, we would switch it to a supplemental levy, which would put that money into the general fund reserve. That was something that was passed by voters a couple years ago.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Our plant facilities used to be about $5.98 million, and the voters in 2018 allowed us to break that in half. To Trustee Stone's point, half of it being a new supplemental levy that then was posted to the general fund when those revenues were received, and half of the original plant facilities that was posted to the plant facilities fund. So to answer Trustee Turner's question about where those funds come from, frankly, originally when we, back in 2017, 18, 16, 17, we had about $6 to $6.5 million as a reserve. And since that time frame, we've been able to build that up to this 12.5 plus this 3.6 million. And those funds came from reductions in spending. The first year I actually arrived, there was about a $1.2 million, $1.3 million reduction in spending plan in that proposed year. We then initiated another 1.2 to 1.3 in that 17-18 year. Then we ran the supplemental levy. So we've been working hard at A, reducing expenses, but then B, setting aside revenues that we received from the plant or from the supplemental levy, the 2-year supplemental levy specifically, to be able to save for the rainy day funds that we have available to us today to spend to call it COVID-19 as a rainy day scenario. So, Trustee Turner, did I answer your question? Can I elaborate or answer other items?
That was a great explanation. I was a little confused as to what flowed into that reserve fund, and I appreciate all the background. So I'm fine. We can go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate the question because I think that there's probably a number of people were wondering exactly that same thing. Where did those funds come from? So switching gears from revenues to expenses, we did make in the 2021 year, we did go in and pull out funds to reduce our expense footprint again. And the idea behind that was to try to parallel some of the lost funding associated with the 5% holdback from the governor's office. And when we take a look at expenses, it's roughly $1 million drop. I'll say that as a round number. Part of that was a gift, and that gift came in the form of the PERSI unused sick leave. That's an expense that we pay on behalf of all employees into a PERSI account. That PERSI account, and what that is so when somebody retires as a PERSI member, you can use a value associated with your unused sick leave that you can then use to pay for insurance benefits in your retirement. That's very helpful to those folks who are trying to bridge the gap between retirement and Medicare. So if you retire at 63, you have some unused sick leave, there's a benefit that you can draw on to pay for health insurance, dental insurance, to get you until you reach the age of 65. And you can use it beyond that, but you can use it maybe for donut hole, Medicare coverage, dental coverage, things of that nature. So that particular PERSI fund was overfunded by it was over 200%. So for the current year, for several of the months, and then through the 2021 year, that will not be an item that will be charged against the district, so we don't have to pay that. For us, that was roughly a $350,000 sum. And So we were able to take that opportunity to not spend those dollars. So rather than redirect those, we're not spending those dollars. Bad news is when the 21-22 year comes around, that will now become an on-budget item. So it's defined as a holiday, and that's the language or the terminology that Percy has used. So the big chunk associated with our reduction really does come from that holiday. We did have a planned reduction, about $250,000 in the curriculum budget. And the reason why we had that planned reduction was in our current year, we spent more than we would on an average year in the curriculum to pay for items this year rather than spread that expense over 2 years. So again, by either good planning or happen chance, good luck. I'll take either. I'm happier to be lucky than well planned. But it turns out in a year when we're really needing to reduce expenses, we have this $250,000 planned reduction in curriculum that to add to that or to contribute to that $1 million goal. We also went across and asked operational budgets, so all departments. And I think one important note on here for both operational budgets and school budgets, we went and asked them to reduce by 5%. And I think it's important to note that this isn't a staffing level decrease. It's their, if you think about their supplies, classroom supplies, contracts for maintaining grounds, professional development that the school might have otherwise spent, funds for subs, things of that nature. So this isn't a 5% across the entire aspect of a school's budget, including staff. It is really relegated to the things component of their budgets, not the people component of their budgets. We also booked a $100,000 reduction in utility expenses. That's always a gamble. It's always a gamble because this was actually relatively benign year utility-wise. It was going into the COVID-19, and then with the COVID-19, we've seen some reduction in the need for heating buildings since we don't have students in them. We don't have as much water demand because we're not flushing as many toilets, washing as many hands at the particular building. Parents are probably picking up that cost with the kids being home, but at least we saw that as a reduction here at the school level. So assuming that next year is not going to be one of those years where we're starting to have record cold days, record lows, we're anticipating being able to book $100,000 less in utility expense. And then again, another item that is very difficult to forecast, but this particular year we had a reduction in our long-term sub cost, and that reduction is I built in a little piece of the reduction associated with that. Certainly, one of the drawbacks to long-term subs is that, and just to provide a definition of long-term subs, when a teacher's going to be out for an extended period of time, say they had a surgery or they had an accident, or during a pregnancy, the district covers after the school covers the first 2 weeks of that absence, and then the district covers the cost beyond that, because it's unfair to really think about it as insurance. It's really an insurance for the schools to not have to cover this unforeseen variable cost in terms of covering a sub. So the district picks up a piece of that. The last couple of years, we haven't hit the maximum amount on that budget, so it seems appropriate to roll that back. But certainly next year may be that time period where we see an undue number of expenses that come along that require more sub expense or for that longer time period than a traditional year. And then finally, the last line item that I have there is that our liability and property insurance projecting a $30,000 increase. So that's the opposite of the items that we looked at above that were actual reductions in spending. There will be an increase in spending on that particular line item. So
as to the three largest of those reductions, the unused sick leave, the reduction in the curriculum budget, and the reduction in the operational budgets, where's that money coming from? What are we reducing that produces those figures?
So to the unused sick leave, those are funds that we would have otherwise spent. So if the holiday wasn't in place, than the reduction, and it's a reduction predicated upon what we spent in 1920. So you look at the 1920 year as a benchmark, that 350 is a reduction associated with the unused sick leave benefit. So instead of having a bill over the course of the 2021 year for 350,000 on which is due on a monthly basis, we'll have a bill of $0.
Okay. And then as to the other two, operational and curriculum budgets?
Yeah, and both of those, again, are referencing using the 1920 fiscal year as a benchmark on where that spending would have otherwise been. So rather than spend 250,000 more or less in the current 1920 year for the curriculum that we had purchased and spread that over 2 years, we spent that in 1 year. So again, it's money that we would have otherwise booked in the 2021 year, but we pre-spent that. Maybe that's not the best terminology, but we pre-spent that money in the 1920 year. Therefore, it will be an unspent amount in the 2021 year. And finally, the 5% budgets, it's probably a lot like what the state has imposed on districts, which is funds that you would have otherwise received as, let's just say as a school, your budget was going to be $100,000 in the 2021 year. We've rolled that back to $95,000 for a 5% reduction, and that's schools and operational budgets. So again, it's using where you would have otherwise been to roll back what you're budgeting moving forward into the 2021 year.
And are the building principals responsible for instituting that, deciding what's going to be cut back?
That's correct. So what we had asked principals and department heads is to make a 5% reduction in their budgets and make the determination as to how they want to implement that. Some of them said, well, let's just take my budget and reduce every line item by 5%. So again, my budget was in March 100,000, but now that we realize we need to have a reduction later on, your budget's now 95,000. So they would return the budget back to me based on 95,000, identifying those specific areas in their budget where they wanted to make reductions. It was the same for operational departments as well. So Howie had to make some reductions in his maintenance expense line items, again, exclusive of staff. This didn't include staff. So he had to go back and sharpen his pencil in regards to what he was planning to budget for maybe some of his contracted services and maybe some of the equipment that he might have otherwise purchased that will be postponed a year because the reduction in his spending. Same with technology, same with business ops being finance and HR. So we took all non-staff budgets essentially and reduced them by that 5% number.
Trustee Stone.
And so each department head that you just listed off prepares a budget and presents that to you after you've told them there needs to be a 5% reduction?
That's correct, yeah. So we started off, I frequently, when I send out a budget, I'll have two numbers. And so your budget, well, there's a conservative number and what I call the optimistic and the pessimistic. And the optimistic usually has an increase, and the pessimistic usually is a flat budget. It turns out this year that pessimistic, after I'd sent them the original budgets, they sent it back to me. Pessimistic became a 5% reduction. So I asked them to revisit their budgets to reduce it by that 5% amount that they sent back to me.
All right.
So I think that probably the short answer to your question was yes, the department heads provided back to me a budget with reductions, the 5% reductions included in them.
Yes, Trustee Turner.
Yeah, Brian, I'm trying to get my hands around this. So under the context of your opening statement, this said, we're transitioning to a smaller expense footprint. And what I'm looking at here, I don't know if I could call it a footprint. It's so infinitesimal. What it looks like the unpaid sick leave is like you said, it's a gift. It's a one-timer. the curriculum budget reduction was essentially a timing issue. We paid more the previous year. We're going to pay less this year. And that leaves us with, I'm trying to look at this thing, utility expense. I'm not sure if that's real. About $300,000 actual reductions. I mean, things that we can look at as ongoing that we could plan for next year and next year. I'm just wondering if $300,000 in a budget this size is a meaningful reduction in expense footprint.
Yeah, a lot of the reductions, frankly, that we have, some of the biggest ones are items that are not materializing next year that would otherwise have materialized. And the $350,000 is a good example of that, the unused sick leave. Right, we're not incurring that expense, but we would have otherwise incurred that expense. An item that we didn't talk about, which doesn't have any savings next year, but if we had developed a calculation for what salary schedule movement for all the various staff members by stepping down one step would have had a cost that would have been incurred. That not taking place means that relative to where we would have otherwise been, we're able to freeze that and not see expenses actually augment by that sum.
Which was about $886,000.
For all three groups of staff members, correct.
But you're not really reducing anything, right?
You're just not increasing it.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Not increasing it.
There's no savings here. We're slowing the rate of increase versus a revenue pie that's actually shrinking dramatically.
Right.
So,
Yes.
Okay. I'm solid.
Yes. I always try to be conscientious about the whole aspect of, drives me nuts when I hear our friends in Washington talk about, well, we're taking a cut, and you find out actually it went up by 10%. Well, it was planned to go up by 15%, so we had a cut in the increase. So that is not my intent to try to convey, is that there's some smoke and mirrors in regards to, well, it's a cut in the increase. But it is a cut in the increase. We do have a holiday. We actually reduced budgets relative to where they would have otherwise been, and we do anticipate having some reductions in regards to the utility expense, again, relative to a year where we did not spend it. So I can understand from the perspective of looking at this that the actual tangible cuts as a decrease isn't like we took a $100 million budget and reduced it to 99. These are reductions in what we would have otherwise spent or what was planned. Yeah, Dr. Holmes.
I was just going to point out that in the previous years, like the year you arrived when we were cutting 1.2 and the year after that when we were cutting 1.3, though a lot of that cutting was reduction in staff and in some programming. In fact, I think, Trustee Turner, you're familiar with the fact that we cut summer school. Mm-hmm. That might be where we are a year from now when we have a better handle on what our enrollment's going to be in this post-COVID world. And depending on how long this COVID pandemic stays around. But one of the things we discussed was not having an immediate reaction to that and laying people off that then we'll need back later, but rather letting it develop and see what we really have going on and making those decisions throughout the year in preparation for next year's budget. Is that accurate, Mr. Fletcher?
Yep, that's correct.
Trustee Stone.
And I would argue that as much as it's important to be careful in how we're doing the spending and to cut back expenses when we need to, that stability is also really important, and not having a kind of knee-jerk reaction. Like you're saying, if you cut programs and let people go, but the next year you can have them back, that provides a lot of disruption that is distracting as well. And so trying to find a balance with what does have to be cut long-term and have some stability in the meantime, is kind of a balance, I think, that is important to find.
All right, Brian, go ahead.
Okay, so When we break down our expenditure categories into what we call programs or function programs, and these are definitions that are provided by the state of Idaho and through what they call IFARMS, which is a set of accounting rules and parameters that we report back up to the state, and then they're able to have a uniform manner in which to compare expenses and revenues across the entire state of Idaho. When we look at our budgeted 1920 versus our budgeted 2021, you can see that we do have a reduction of the 6.2, which is commensurate with what we saw in the revenues, and a total budget of $57.88032 million. When we compare these side by side, a number of these reductions or these differences, we've talked about some of these things, but a chunk of this is what we might call employee churn. So if you think about how we're going through our budgeting process, we start our budgeting process in January, we start developing numbers, and we start working with those and sitting down to negotiate in April and May. And that staffing footprint that we have in that time period will ultimately be different when we end up coming into school in August. We'll have people that will retire, we'll have people that will resign, exercise other opportunities for employment. And so if you think about what's built into here is that difference between that budget season back in 2019-20, and today in this budget season, we have people entering and exiting our list of staff, and so we're truing up to 1920 with the uncertainty of what 2021 will actually look like, because we will have individuals that will retire, resign, leave our system, be replaced by people who most likely won't be paid exactly the same thing. They'll either be higher on that salary schedule or they'll be lower on that salary schedule. If it's a retiree that steps out, almost universally, you have somebody who comes in to backfill them that is actually lower on that salary schedule, so there's a cost savings. But if you have somebody that has resigned, they may have been lower on the salary schedule and then is backfilled by somebody who comes in with existing experience that then ends up actually costing the district more to fill that position. So we sort of have this churn of employees. So with that churn of employees, you get a lot of variation, a lot of disharmony in the numbers that create some of these variances. So even if we didn't touch any other budget other than looking at just staffing, we would actually see some variation in these numbers. So a chunk of the movement here really does revolve around that. But to just sort of highlight a couple of the items that we had talked about, or a couple of items that are making some of the larger impact here. The first thing that obviously jumps off the page, if we go back to that revenue list, is that $5 million on-budget transfer option from the general fund to the financial emergency fund. We take that out of the equation, that's a big move. In addition, we did have an 8.8% healthcare increase, or health insurance rather, increase for the year for all employees. As a part of negotiations, the district picked that up. That's part of the churn associated with the numbers that we see here. We talked about the shift in curriculum cost. We talked about the smaller contingency reserve going from 2.7 million down to 2.5. We talked about the reduction in certified PD cost in the previous meeting where that was an outcome of the negotiations. We've already talked about the reduction in the PERSI sick leave expense, which is a holiday for the 2021 year. We also talked about reductions in operations and school budget by the 5%. We talked about the reduction in estimated utility costs. And most of the churn is actually affiliated with just staff movement. I think that covers most of the things on this line item here. But if there aren't, and again, this is looking at one of the drawbacks of this, and that has come up in conversation, is the way this looks at information. It does look at a program function rather than a department as a whole. Rather than looking at the Haley Elementary School as a specific itemized department that we could evaluate, you will find that the Haley School budget actually has pieces in the elementary program, pieces in the exceptional child, pieces in gifted and talented, and on and on and on down the list of function programs here. So that is certainly one of the drawbacks associated with this sort of methodology of tracking those expenses and then presenting them.
Brian, can you scroll down there just a little bit? Yes, there under community services programs, moved a number of contract services such as translation into this account. Don't we carry a translator as part of the communications department?
Yes, we do have a translator who's actually she's paid in the district administration account, and she does do the translation. She does a lot of the translation associated with the communications department, whether that comes directly from the communications department or if it's something that's an item for the superintendent or for the business office. But there are also translations associated with the special ed with IEPs. And given the volume of translation needs that we have to farm out to a third-party service some of that work so that it's completed in a timely manner and we can provide that information to parents. And so originally those translation services were either housed in the special ed programming line item, and it made sense to me to move them down to that community services program. Most of what you see in that community services program, a big chunk of that is actually our property and liability insurance. So a piece of that 60 is associated with that increase that we had talked about a little earlier. But yeah, to answer your question, we do have translator. She provides services, but given the volume we have, we actually have to seek third-party support on that.
And I guess I'm not sure why insurance would be included on that line item.
So it's kind of a bad, frankly, a number of the labels that exist here are labels that I don't think would be the best to apply. Community service program makes it sound as though that's where we're feeding students from. That's where we're reaching out to the community. Frankly, that it's our district contracts, so district-wide contracts are and the expenses associated with those. That's where we park those expenses. So think about the insurance being a district-wide type of application. So that's why the expenses park there. Translation services is district-wide, and from the perspective of we receive a number of translation requests from all the different schools across the district.
Trustee Stone?
And so, just to be clear, you have a translator on staff, and the budget for that is in the district administration program?
That's correct, yep.
But the $60,000 difference here is for the translation services outsourcing that we do. And where was that in the budget last year?
So a big chunk of that was last year's when I started moving that out of the special ed and into this particular line item. So previously you would have found a chunk of it in special ed, a chunk of it in the district administration. And just for clarity's sake, the communication budget is also a subset of that district administration program line item. So you would have found it sort of sprinkled around in different areas, and it made sense to me to consolidate that in this particular line item. But 30,000 of that 60,000 is associated with the insurance increase. The remaining 30,000 isn't necessarily 100% translation. It'll be a piece of that, but it's a piece of other district-wide contracts that I'm budgeting shall I say, a cushion for, so under the assumption that we're going to see more translation needs, and we're going to see an increase in other types of district-wide services and contracts, possibly for COVID-19. That might find its way into our budget.
Brian, let me ask this, and I certainly do not mean to cast any aspersions on anybody, but how are these decisions made? For instance, why is there not a line item or a category for the communications department, and instead it seems to be subsumed under some other rubric? Who makes that decision as to how that's going to be broken out?
So that's a good question. So the function programs that you see here in that column B or in that that left-hand column, those are actually defined by the state of Idaho. So as much as I might want to, for instance, change the name of the Central Services Program to technology, because that's really what it is. And that's what makes sense to me. The state of Idaho says you'll code your technology-related, general fund technology-related expenses to the Central Services Program. You'll charge your district administration program for your superintendent, your assistant superintendent, district office staff. So a lot of these things are defined by the state of Idaho, and the purpose for that is so that they have a uniform method of comparability across the state for all districts, so that we're not calling.
Oh, we lost contact.
Keith, I think Dan had a question too.
By function code, maybe it makes more sense to provide those delineations by departments or by schools. So when we look at something like the communications, I can't create a new function line item between district administration and school administration and label that communications, because the state of Idaho would see that and go, I don't understand where that fits within our nomenclature or the structure of nomenclature on how they define these various function codes. So that's why we have to pick one of these areas to park those particular departments. In this particular case, district administration makes sense for the communications because they operate within the district component of the school district itself. An alternative has certainly have been the business operations, but from a historical purpose or a historical basis, it has, at least here in Blaine County, been parked in that district administration program. So for continuity and historical purposes, I've kept it there.
I'll get to your questions in just a moment, Trustees Stone and Turner. In terms, I understand that you have to account for all of this in a format that's dictated by the state. It isn't of your choosing. However, there would not be anything standing in the way of you providing an executive summary to the board for its own purposes, would there?
That's absolutely correct. In fact, none of the material as presented in the format here tonight is required by the state of Idaho. How I report that up to the state of Idaho is determined by them. So if the board has a desire to see these expenses structured in a different manner and presented in that manner, be it an executive summary or pie charts or graphs, then there's certainly nothing that the state of Idaho would do to stand in the way of that material or information being presented and provided to the board in that manner.
So, and not to monopolize things or to single out any department, but in this current format, what I'm suggesting as being a separate summary for the board's purposes, how would I as a trustee, or how would I as a member of the public, a taxpayer, put together all of the facts and figures necessary to determine what the communications department is costing the district?
So as the information presented in this particular structure, it denies the reader the opportunity to delineate a communications budget or a human resources budget or a finance budget because of the consolidation associated with those various departments within these function program codes. So in order to provide that information, it would need to be delineated separately or in a different format. I mean, it can be an Excel or Word document, but the structure of how we would look at that would be, this is the communications budget, this is what it looks like, and presented in its singularity rather than in a rolled up in this sort of format within a function or program.
Trustee Turner, you were first, I believe.
Yeah, thank you. So I look at this, the 1920 budget, And again, it's a budget. At the end of the year, your expenses and revenues are traditionally not spot on. So I'm trying to get a flavor for what kind of variances historically can we expect budget versus actual operating results. So, I mean, is it unusual to expect a 300 basis points variance, 200? I mean, obviously, this general fund grew over time out of surpluses where budgeted numbers were lower than, or there was a budget surplus that accrued into this general fund. So the basic question is, how good are you guys at these budget numbers? I mean, what kind of variance is acceptable? What's kind of our historical track record when it comes to bringing budgets in on the mark?
So that's a good question. The fact of the matter is when you look at the history of budgets and how close the arrow hit, and the arrow representing actual spending or actual parameters of revenues and expenses versus that budget, you're going to find that it's pretty much all over the board. Now, I've only looked at data going back about 10 years. I haven't spent too much time past that for a couple of reasons. One, in 2006 and then being implemented in 2007, there was a new funding structure that was put in place. That's when the district's stabilization levy arrived and the maintenance and operations piece went away. That and the manner of which districts were funded completely changed. So data before that, probably because of that change in funding mechanism and structure, isn't as relevant as it would otherwise be. But when you look back, we see that up until about 2011, we had we were saving money. We were growing reserves. And after that time frame, that's when reserves started to contract. And there was a consistent set of years, and I'd be happy to send you this information so that you can see it. I have it in graphical representation. But you'll see that the budget actually started to draw down those reserves. And those reserves were in the vicinity of 14 to 15 million, very similar to where we're at today. And those reserves were drawn down to 6.5 million. And that was the point that we turned it around, and then we grew those reserves back up to 15 million. So when you look at in regards to how close did that arrow come to that center point, that bullseye, I think you're going to find there's quite actually a great deal of variability as both being a positive and a negative aspect of those basis points. Mm-hmm. So for 10 years, we had at least half of I would say roughly half those years, we saw contractions. And in half those years, maybe just slightly more than those half a years, you've seen augmentations. Mm-hmm. So I'd love to tell you that, hey, we hit that number. And when I say we, I'm really talking about my predecessor because I'm just completing my 4th year here. So when I look at the numbers that we have here, I think, Trustee Turner, you could even point to it and say, Brian, you're all over the board, because my first year here, we brought it in 150,000 over. That was the difference. Mm-hmm. And in our previous year, it was 5 million. So when you look at the spread between those points, there's quite a dramatic spread. My defense to that isn't that it's bad budgeting. Perhaps it is. Maybe it's bad budgeting. Maybe it's very lucky budgeting. But it was part of our plan in regards to collect revenues and set those aside so that we were able to augment our reserves to grow those during these 2-year supplemental levy periods.
So in those years where you grew the reserves, as those years began, there was a built-in surplus in those budgets, or things just worked out to where there was a surplus at the end of the year when all the accounts were settled?
Both. So to answer that most definitively, there were years where we had unassigned revenues that were coming in that were larger than the budgeted expenses, on top of which we were able to bring those expenses in lower than what were originally budgeted. So you would find that both of those cases would be accurate.
I appreciate it. Thank you for the color.
Trustee Stone.
I don't have any further questions right now.
Dr. Holmes, did you?
Yeah, Brian won't brag on himself, so I want to add on that I think we're much closer to coming into where we project that we will come in now. In the years that Brian has been with us, he has been very helpful in establishing a system where principals have a lot more decision making, but they also have a lot more accountability. It used to be that you just walk in with a bill and the district office would pay it whether it had been budgeted or not. And Brian and I work very well together in both of us saying no, so you can't. and that has helped our buildings learn to be responsible for what they spend. So they have a lot of freedom in how they spend it, but our departments and our buildings also have a lot of accountability to not exceed their budget.
All right, Brian, you want to go ahead now that you've been patted on the back?
Yes, thank you very much. Graphing the material that we looked at breaking that down into the categories of salary and benefits, fringe. Last year, somebody asked me to not use the term fringe. So to that person, I apologize. Fringe snuck back into my presentation again, but that's really salary and benefits. Looking at insurance, transfers, insurance, property liability, it's not health insurance. The health insurance, those types of personal or individual insurances are included in the benefit, salary and benefit line item. Insurance I'm talking about is from that community services line item, and that is for our property and liability insurance. Transfers are transfers or shortages from one federal fund or a state fund, or let's just say the preschool fund, which is really money from the general fund supports the vast majority of that. When we get to the preschool, we'll talk about that a little bit. But that's what transfers are. They're really transfers from the general fund to these other funds to basically equal out the shortage in revenues relative to their expenses. The contingency we've talked about, so 4.5 million of that is 2.5. Purchase services, think about hiring a plumber. I'm not saying that's what Howie does, but that's just an easy example because we have plumbers on staff. We hire somebody for professional development purposes. We hire somebody to come in and do some translation work. Equipment, building, site improvements, you'll notice that's actually a fairly small number, and the luxury that we have on having equipment and site improvements be such a small number is because we do have, to Trustee Turner's earlier comment about the plant facilities, we do have those funds available. They will be on budget, and we'll get to that in just a short bit, in regards to assisting in relieving the expenses that would otherwise be incurred at the general fund level. And finally, supplies and materials. Think about classroom supplies, copy paper, things of that nature. Also purchase services, that's where you'll find utility expense. So that's a large contributor to that line item. When we graphically represent this, usually the aha moment is the obvious mid blue, not the royal blue. The royal blue is about 4% there at supplies and materials, but that mid blue color of salary and benefits. When you think about it, we're really a personnel business. And so people in our general fund in terms of operations is going to be that largest percentage. That is not unusual across the state of Idaho to have the general fund operations be consumed by about 80 to 85% of salary and benefits. Again, we have that luxury of that plant facilities to facilitate the maintenance and modifications of those facilities. And typically those facilities are either built typically with bond monies or with plant facility. Again, not with general fund monies. So that's the reason why that number looks so high or such a large percent. And the equipment percent, it says 0 on this graph. It's really less than 1%. So when it rounds out in Excel, it wants to report that as 0%. So just a summary of what we just looked at. I want to make sure that I'm actually just absolutely clear that the general fund contingency is an expense line item that's budgeted every year with the intent of not spending it. It exists as a cushion, but the goal is to actually bring expenses in less than what that amount is. So A, you don't spend your contingency reserve, and B, you hope that you actually have more revenues than expenses. That's my goal every year. Even in a year where it's 3.7, it might be a tall order. 3.7 million that were drawn down from the reserve, that might be a tall order to facilitate, but we want to minimize that reserve reduction as great as possible. The maximum amount, as we talked about earlier, for that contingency reserve can only be 5%. And 2.5 million is a rounded down number affiliated with that. And so you'll see a revenue line item on that revenue graph. That's funds pulling from our carryover to cover the contingency reserve of 2.5, and the contingency reserve in the expense line item is 2.5. So the idea of those funds are to net out to zero one another, so that they are benign in the way we look at that the general fund. So in summary, the total general fund revenues we're looking at is 53.4 million. The expenses at 57 million. That's where we get the delta of 3.7 million, which is the drawdown from the general fund reserve, that 12.5 million blue pie chart that we looked at earlier. That's where those funds are coming from. So the budget book has, and I won't go through this line by line by line. I could probably be here considerably late if we were to do that. But if we look back, referencing back to the sheet that we looked at that were referenced, let's see, right here, these various programmatic line items, we can see that defined within the budget book. First by the programmatic line item, elementary program, then secondary program, and then within each one of these of the categories of salaries, and then benefits, and then purchase services, and then supplies, and capital objects is a fancy word for equipment. And for the most part, again, you'll find that equipment will be by and large a very small number relative to the overall budget. But you'll see that there's an extensive number of line items. And there's that group of line items, or most of those line items exist for each of those programmatic defined parameters that we looked at on that previous slide. One other item that I included, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but we included the position count changes from the 2015-16 year to the 19-20 year. And you can see that there are some reductions in staff. There are some modifications in staff, and the one that I can point out most easily here is the accounting manager was an administrative level position, and that was modified to be a financial specialist position on the classified salary schedule. That person was not reduced, so what we have is this 0.5 administrative assistant, that was actually reduced out of the finance department or across the district office, but the accounting manager is a one-person modification from the reduced to the add, so it nets out to no actual reduction in staff. So there's a number of those things as we look through here.
If I could, Brian, does it result in a reduction of expenditure?
It does result in a reduction in expenditure because we had fewer bodies. So now, with that being said,
but moving him, if you would, from administrative to classified, did that put him at a different salary level?
Oh yes, I see what you're talking. I'm sorry, I thought you were talking about the overall aspect of all of the various movements. So what that did is it took them off the administrative salary schedule and put them on the classified. We kept their pay the same, but they lost the administrator benefit package that otherwise came along with that. And the person is now frozen on that classified schedule until the schedule catches up with them over the given course of time. So they would be at that bottom level of that salary schedule, but they have to wait for the salary schedule to augment through cost of living increases over time to catch up with them before they'll see a pay increase or a pay change.
And if you had been so inclined, or Dr. Holmes had been, or whoever makes that final decision, when he or she was moved from administrative to classified, could the salary have been reduced?
Yes, it could have been reduced. Now, that was in the realm of options. As an individual who is a classified person, whether you're deemed as by this district as an administrator or not, there would have been the opportunity to reduce their salary.
And who makes that decision in the end? Who decides to make that transfer, if you will, from administrative to classified.
So that was I'm sorry, go ahead, Dr. Holmes.
I was going to say that when it's a classified position, it has to have my final approval. And in this particular instance, we had a lot of conversation about level of expectations and how much time you wanted to work versus not work, quality of life. And so those were all a part of the factors that went into this.
I'm not sure I understand what you mean by that.
Well, if you're an administrator, you're expected to be available 24/7. If you don't want to be available 24/7, you want to be available only between certain hours of the day, then you should not be on the administrator's salary schedule.
Whose choice is that, the employee or you?
It could be either one of us. And this one, it was mutual. We had the conversation about time spent, and then they had the conversation about the time they wanted to spend, and it was a mutual, but it could be me.
All right, Trustee Stone, I think you had a question?
You asked all my questions, so I'm set. Thank you.
And now Trustee Turner? I think you're muted, Dan.
My apologies. I'm sorry. Brian, when I'm looking at this chart here, I want to make sure I'm understanding it. This is a four-year migration of additions and deletions. Is it correct? So this isn't just what happened in the last year. This is a 4-year period we're looking at.
It is a multi-year period. That's correct.
And then if you could scroll down to the bottom of that spreadsheet a bit there, is you a little farther. Okay. Just pet peeve when we're looking at spreadsheets and budgets. I love numbers. I'd love to see what the financial impact of these changes are. If we could have at the bottom, what did this mean to us from a budgetary standpoint? I mean, I think that would be relevant to the information we're receiving here.
So I suppose the challenge associated with that is, given the extreme churn that you see in all of the various positions, and the who left and who stayed and where would the replacement fall in the salary schedule, it would certainly be only our best guess at that. But to your point there, without having some kind of financial connection to it, some of the information does ring a little hollow from a financial perspective.
Yeah, frankly, I find this of dubious value. I don't, if we're talking about a budget, I'd like to see what the numbers are. That's all.
Certainly, yeah. When we put it together, it was more of a driver behind FTE, and FTE being full-time equivalent, or the number of staff, and sort of illustrates that we have had some reductions. We've actually had some increases. The HR individual going from a generalist to a director, and then we've had quite a bit of churn in regards to the number of certified positions. Some of those certified positions that came on board were contracted previously, so it wasn't that we weren't paying for them, but they're now an employee. And also there's a reduction in the number of paraprofessionals, or if you think about classroom aides, you see we went from about 98 down to about 72 and a half. And there's a variety of different reasons affiliated with that. So, but I certainly take to heart your comment that from a financial perspective, it doesn't necessarily deliver the information that a reader would be looking for.
Thank you.
Trustee Stone, is there a question I didn't ask that you want?
I found one you didn't ask. What is what's the purpose of the timeframes that were selected for this? What's the significance of this 4-year spread versus last year to this year, or 10 years ago to now?
Dr. Holmes can correct me. I thought it was the time period that Dr. Holmes was.
Yeah, it's a time period when we really started pulling in the budget to get it back in balance with what our revenues were. So, and of course, that's the history that I know. I don't know prior to that, but that 15-16 was the first year when we really started trying to cut the 1.2, and then the following year, the 1.3.
Got it. Thanks.
Go ahead, Brian.
Thank you. So that it concludes the conversation associated with the general fund. And now what I'd like to do is move to the special funds. And the special funds are all of the sundry of other funds, roughly about 22 of them, that make up all these other types of either programs or funding level being local versus state versus federal. And this is a subject that I could probably spend the next 3, 4, 5 hours talking about if we drill down deeply into each one of these. Because just like the general fund, there's a lot of moving parts. On many of these, there's a lot of moving parts also. But one of the things that...
If it's all the same to you, let's not drill that far.
I certainly appreciate that. One of the things you'll notice about many of these graphic illustrations, and last year I used this as a graphic illustration to try to capture a snapshot of how things are looking in a way that you could look at, get a perspective, a pretty quick overview, and without really digging deeply into the numbers. And you'll find that a lot of these funds are actually fairly similar from one year to the next. And much of that revolves around that federal funding has a certain degree of consistency to it. Now, I say that. Now, next year, our Title I funding will drop. We anticipate that being dropped because most recent census numbers are showing that the poverty level in the school district's boundaries has dropped and as relative to other communities across the nation and across Idaho. So we're seeing our funding in that category drop. But you'll see that there's a general kind of flatness to many of these funds as we look through them. Our forest funds revenue, it just keeps dropping. And essentially, these are funds that come to us for rural purposes, you got to be a rural district, and the use of these funds is really fairly open-ended. Frankly, we budgeted $30,000 for the 1920 year, and our first installment was about $12,000. So it wasn't a big chunk. It's not something that really makes a big impact on the district. But I just finished telling you how flat most of these are going to be in a comparable way, and you look at the first one, and there's actually quite a drop there. Outdoor education is for our middle school students. We provide funding to each of the schools that have middle school students, and they engage in some type of outdoor education program. Carrie goes to Yellowstone, and the Wood River Middle School goes to up to the Cathedral Pines facility. They call it Rose Camp. And then the Hemingway students, they go over to McCall, over to the University of Idaho facility. And so I don't know how that will look in a COVID-19 year, but we do have that on budget as an opportunity for them to use those funds, whether they opt to engage in those kinds of activities or choose an alternative, but we'd still need funding. The reason why that number has dropped just a little bit is because the anticipated number of students at the middle school level is anticipated to drop next year. The Academy's revenues, you'll see that's fairly flat. The reason why that's fairly flat is that that pays for basically 2 teachers at the Wood River High School level, and this is the outdoor ed it is the Wood River High School Residential Construction Academy, and then the MedTech program. And again, this is a historical thing that when I arrived, historically, these were tracked separately, so we've just continued that same process. But you can see that the slight difference there, it's essentially flat going from our current year to next year. Preschool, in preschool, this is the program that, since funding that comes through the K-12 mechanism from the state, we're not actually legally allowed to use those funds for preschool revenue, with a few exceptions. So most of our preschools are actually funded by local property tax dollars, which is why we track these expenses separately. And those expenses, as you can see, I'll say it's reasonably flat, just a slight change, and that comes from a shift of employees from the previous year into our current year. Anticipate having those be the same employees next year, but there was a price increase or a salary increase associated with that. Our revenue from users is about 10,000 to 30,000 in any given year. And I have I'll call it a graph. It's some material in regards to how the determination of who pays and who doesn't pay for preschool tuition. But you can see, predicated upon almost $500,000 in expenses, we have about a $10,000 to $30,000 average annual amount that offsets that expense. So the general fund really ends up paying for this preschool fund, and that does come in the form of the stabilization funds. If we didn't have those stabilization levy dollars, we really wouldn't have a preschool program. Certainly not one as robust as we have today. Next one is community campus. So again, we have to track that separately. The state doesn't allow us to use the K-12 funding for any purpose associated with a community type of activity. So these particular funds are used to support our community campus over there. Our partners pay for over half the amount. On a monthly basis. So our partners assist the two equity partners, being CSI and BCRD, to assist us in covering expenses affiliated with custodial costs and utility expense. Financial emergency reserve. It looks like we're taking a big hit here. And I'll refer back to that $5 million on budget line item for 1920 that did not take place. That's why it looks like we're actually taking a drop. The fact of the matter is the financial emergency reserve will grow by the amount of interest that those idle funds that are parked today will increase by. So while that looks like it's that is an illusion in regards to the revenue differential between the two fiscal periods. Driver's ed, we track that separately, anticipating a little less revenue next year. Because of COVID-19, but essentially you frequently find this is fairly flat. State career technical education, CTE, career technical education, usually fairly flat from one year to the next. And the reason behind that is because it's based on the number of programs that we have here, unless we augment an offering such as, I'll call it small engine repair. That would be an option, or an ag program. Unless we do something like that, we really don't see any significant increase. There's marginal increases in the funding that comes through the state for those programs. State grant revenue, we're actually seeing a slight drop there. That's because the funds for the Silver Creek Mastery of Education grant and our GATE funds are actually dropping slightly. Title I revenue, we talked about the census data is supporting identifying a lower number of poverty students that meet the criteria for poverty. So we're actually seeing fewer funds next year. IDEA, that's the first one is for school age, K through 12. And then IDEA preschool is just a preschool for special needs students. And those are essentially flat. The reason why preschool looks like it's jumping up is because we pay for a quarter or a 0.25 of a preschool teacher's FTE who teaches that program. And in concert with that, we'll see an increase because the person is changing next year. And so that revenue really just means that there's a drawdown from the general fund that is coming in, increasing that revenue. The alternative would have been to keep the revenue line item flat and just transfer the expense from this particular line item over to the general fund. Medicaid, anticipate that being down a little bit. Again, I'm trying to get in front of the COVID-19. Title IV, anticipate that being down a little bit. It's a derivative of Title I. So we anticipate a little less money in that category. Perkins is the federal CTE or career technical. Expect that to be almost flat next year. And that has been very consistent over the course of the last many years. Title IIIA and Title IIA, again, we're anticipating those to be nearly flat from one year to the next. Title IIIA is federal funding for English language acquisition or ELA students. Title IIA is for federal funding for professional development. We use those funds for paying our mentors, staff. So teachers who are mentoring brand new teachers or first-year teachers, we're obligated to provide that service. So we compensate teachers through this mechanism of funding. And we also use this for, didn't use much of it this year, for going to various schools to try to recruit staff for open positions that we have come the springtime. So recruiting season usually is in early spring, late winter, and so we're able to use those funds for that purpose. Child nutrition revenue is a mixed bag. We have local funding that comes from students who pay for their lunches. We have federal funds that come to us for supplementing students either through the free or reduced program. I should say the free and reduced program. So they either have a free or a reduced meal cost. And the reduction associated that you see here is affiliated with the reduction that we had this year relative to the previous year, but it's also in regards to the COVID-19. So I'm being conservative in regards to the amount of revenue, excuse me, that I anticipate for next year. Land acquisition revenue, we had talked about this in a previous board meeting. The land acquisition fund, those are monies that had been moved into this fund many years ago for the purpose of acquiring new property for new school. That hasn't happened, so these funds have actually been sitting idle, and they will only increase, just like the financial emergency reserve, by the funds that those idle dollars earn in terms of interest. The plant facilities revenue, the reason why we see a consequential or significant drop here is because the $2.99 million that we had received in the 1920 year, with the expiration of that plant facilities levy, will drop off. So what you actually see there is just the carryover from our current fiscal 1920 year projected into the 2021 year. Finally, last two items, bus replacement revenue, or the bus replacement fund. The state of Idaho gives us a chunk of money through our transportation funding line item. They then require us to transfer the amount of depreciation for those buses that we have in our fleet into this bus replacement account. And the reason why is, I imagine the state probably got sort of tired of districts coming and shaking their tin cup saying, you never gave us money for buses. So they created this mechanism where the funding that comes through for depreciation must be, unless there's a waiver provided, and maybe next year that might be the case with COVID-19, but the funds that do come through via that depreciation has to be placed and then used to purchase bus replacement for your next or the future year. On average, we have enough for almost 2 buses. Sometimes it's about 2 buses, but we try to cycle through our fleet of buses after they come off our depreciation schedule. And that depreciation schedule is a 12-year accelerated modified depreciation schedule. So it is not a straight line depreciation schedule. So you get more depreciation value in year 1 than you do in year 12. But after year 12, they come off and you receive no additional monies associated with that bus. It's either in that year or soon after that, we'll cycle that bus out of our fleet and purchase a replacement bus. And we try to do that consistently with at least 1 bus every year so that we don't arrive at a place where we have a dated fleet and then we're trying to play catch up. And finally, the last item is the CARES Act funding. You've probably heard this referred to as stimulus funding, COVID-19 funding. This is the amount of funds that at present that the federal government has provided to the state of Idaho, and then the state of Idaho is then provided to all the various districts. The mechanism for calculating this funding is predicated upon that Title I calculation. And so it's not going to be as robust as maybe other districts on a per student basis, but for us, it's about $239,000. And the reason why 1920 has nothing there is that this is a line item that is, you could spend the money in our current year, but we're budgeting for expenditures in the 2021 year. I'll have a few more things to say about this on a future slide up here. With all due respect, I hope there isn't any funding for 21-22 because I hope we're on the other side of this COVID-19 business. So now looking at expenses.
Brian, if you would please, would this be a convenient place to take a 5-minute break?
For me, absolutely.
If everybody in agreement that we ought to do that?
Yes,
All right, let's declare, let's see, it's 7:52, so let's reconvene at 8 p.m. All right, is everyone back? Let's see. Guess we're missing Kelly, is that right?
I'm here.
Was that Kelly telling me that she was here?
Yes, it was.
All right, Kelly, there you are. Great. So let's see. Amber's here. Yes, we've got a full panel. Brian, as I look at the clock, we have used up 2 hours. You're doing a fantastic job. Can you do it a little bit faster with perhaps skipping over everything below $50,000?
Brian, you're on mute.
There we go. Is that better?
Much.
And all of the best things I had to say were just spoken. So yes, thank you very much. I will move through these things with some degree of speed. In fact, in this particular tab, what I'll do is, rather than go through each of these, because each of these we just discussed in the previous tab from the revenue perspective, this is the expenses. And the expenses will balance with the revenues. And I want to be cautious to say the revenues and carryover from the previous year for a couple of those funds, but subsidies, I use the term subsidy, which is often frequently met with some negativity, but subsidies from the general fund into these other funds to make sure that they balance out to zero at the end of the fiscal year. A couple of exceptions to that, a financial emergency. I did put on budget the 3.55, but the anticipation is that we won't spend that. Driver's ed will have a positive carryover of about 3,000 from this year into next year. The land acquisition fund will have a positive carryover of about 1.3 is a rounded number, and the reason why is because it's just not on budget to spend those dollars. At this particular point in time, we don't seem to have a purpose for it. And then the plant facilities, we will spend, while we will have no new revenues this year in regards to a levy, we will actually have carryover funds that we will use to expend for the purposes that we'll look at in just a few moments. But then those expenses will actually start to trail off in the future years because we'll have fewer carryover dollars without a new plant facilities levy. So we will have a positive carryover at the end of the fiscal year of about $4.7 million. CARES Act fund, we're going to expend all of that next year. And the bus replacement, I forecast about a positive carryover of about 9,000. So I may have cheated some of the subjects on this particular tab, but we do have the information in regards to the detail. Oh, it's not in here. Check the budget book. So if you look in there, you want to look at funds 220 to 427. It will have that information in there where you can see, just like the general fund line item, where the information is provided by fund and then by component of salaries, benefits, purchase service supplies, and equipment. That being said, just taking a quick look at the graph for these particular items, beginning balance really makes up the most or the largest contributor. And if you think about that, it's really because of three funds, that being the Plant Facilities Fund, the Financial Emergency Fund, and the Land Acquisition Fund. Since those are carrying a big chunk forward, that's why we see the orange portion of that pie chart representing the largest portion of funding. It really isn't new funding, it's carryover is a more accurate way of really representing that. Conversely, on the expense side, unlike the general fund, here we see salary and benefits being a smaller piece, and that's subordinated to the debt payment, this orange part, and that will be a plant facilities expense line item. And purchase services, a lot of our technology will be in that purchase service category and then the supply category. So that's why you see more of a spread out delineation. Just talked about this. Again, please see the budget book for the detailed line items. CARES Act, just a quick overview of this. federal funds that are provided to respond and prevent the spread of coronavirus, which referred to as COVID-19 many times in this presentation. That amount of funding is calculated and distributed similar to how Title I funds are determined. We must spend these dollars by September 30th of 2022. So that is not in an inaccurate date. Those funds are allowed to be spent either in portion or in totality next year. And whatever we don't spend, you can spend in the following 21-22 year. But we must expend it all by 2022. Frankly, $240,000 is the amount as a rounded up that we have been informed that we'll receive. So we plan on expending all of that in the 2021 year. We have three categories or three projects, if you will. We're going to expend it on the summer school staff that we otherwise would not have had we not had COVID-19 for at the high school, middle school level, delivering meals during the month of June to our students out in the field. We have 10 sites that we're delivering to. I'll call carry a site that we're delivering to, even though the meal preparation is taking place at the school. And so the delivery and distribution services associated with that, the district is using those funds. The remaining portion, which I'll say roughly is going to be $200,000, we're going to use to pay for custodial staff, and that will allow us to free up money in the general fund that would otherwise have been devoted towards custodial staff to other items such as masks, sanitizer, other COVID-related 19 responses. Preschool, I had mentioned this earlier. This is in the budget book, so I won't spend too much time on it, but this gives you an illustration of the breakdown in regards to who does qualify for a free tuition for their student, and then where the points of payment start for individuals with an household income that increases. So we don't actually get a big chunk of money from this. On some years it's about $10,000, on some years it's about $30,000. Typically it's an average in between. Another area where we have prices are school meals, and we have opted not to increase the meal price or asked the board to not increase the meal price next year. Typically, we increase this about 5 cents per year. And the reason why we do that is the federal government, because they provide that funding through the federal child nutrition program, we can't, we have to increase the pay portion for meals. And the reasoning behind that is the federal government does not want to subsidize free meals. So their concern is that as they increase what they reimburse us for those free and reduced meals, we're able to artificially keep low the meal prices for pay students because the federal program is subsidizing that portion of the meal expense. So we, because of COVID-19, have opted to ask the board to not have an increase from our 1920 year into our 2021 year. We'll see what the feds do in regards to requirements for the 21-22 year, but we may have to make that up. So we may have a 5 or 10 cent increase in the 2021 year to make up. So I'm sure the federal government will provide more details and more guidance on that as the year progresses. Plant facilities, I know we've talked about this before, but it's one of those topics that's so much fun to talk about, particularly for next year, because we are going to make our final debt payment which is due August 1st of 2020, and that will represent the last payment and the last interest payment. If I scroll down just a little bit, you'll see that interest payment associated with that debt, and the district will be long-term debt-free. So the good news is that we have these funds that have been saved over the course of the previous years, and we're able to make that debt payment even though we don't have plant facilities levies coming in. And for future years, that debt obligation will have been extinguished. To give you an idea of what the plant facilities fund itself will look like as we move forward, strictly projections, our starting balance coming into next year, we anticipate to be about $12.5 million. Complete happen chance that number is right about the number associated with that blue chart that we looked at for the general fund reserve. Just one of those weird things in life. They are not the same thing. They are very different things. We're receiving no additional plant facilities levy funds since that levy has expired, so that's a zero amount. I'm estimating about 50,000 in payments that are deferred from previous years where individuals that either did not make full payments on their property taxes or deferred those. Those will trickle in for the next couple of years. We'll then make that 5.4 million debt payment. It probably won't be, in fact, I anticipate it won't be the full 5.4 because in previous years when we made debt payments, that went into a holding account or a sinking fund, if you will. And those dollars, while idle, were earning not much interest, but they were still earning some aspect of interest. So that interest will defer the total amount of that final debt payment. So it won't be the full 5.4 million, which was on our schedule that we looked at the previous slide. It'll be a little less. Interest payment, we'll still have one more interest payment affiliated with that last payment. And then the two items that we have on budget for the plant facility use, technology as a round number, $1 million, and facilities, 1.3. And so when we look at our starting balance and add and subtract these various computations, at the end of the year, forecasting about a $4.7 million difference that will then roll forward into that 21-22 year. So you can see we actually have enough for our full funding for technology and facilities, which is our typical amount of expenditure going into next year and the following year. The year after that, while I'm showing it's 2.5, it'll start to get a little dicey. So that's where we start to find out which things broke that we didn't anticipate spending. Were we able to stay within the 1 million and the 1.3 million represented by the technology and facilities budget line items? Hopefully things will change in the economic and health environment for the country and for the county that allow us to restart that conversation about plant facilities. Certainly will be the board's prerogative as to whether we pursue that in future years or not. We saw this in the last, in fact, this slide and the next slide, saw this in the last board meeting. Just a quick overview. Technology director has identified 995,000, rounded that up to 1 million for a budget request. And then for Howard Royal, our director of facilities, buildings and grounds, he has prepared this plant facilities budget. This says 1920. Please forgive me, that actually should be 2021. Yes, 2021. Apparently it's getting late. And you can see the projects, the locations, and the estimated costs that we have. Again, I'm not going to go through this entire thing, but you can see we have quite a number. It rolls up to 1.29, rounded up at 1.3 million as a budget ask. Contracts. We have contracts that are over 25,000 that we've listed here to identify our estimated cost of those contracts. Some of them we know, some of them are estimations. And so we provide that as a list of items to just give the board a heads up of these items so that we that are embedded within our these various line items that we looked at within the budget. So with that being said, for those folks who are interested in looking at the budget book, just a quick directional map here. If you go to our webpage at www.blaineschools.org, where you see departments here, this highlighted box around departments, you want to click on that. When you do, it'll provide a drop down. You'll see one of the options is finance. Where this is circled, you'll want to click on that finance tab. From there, it will take you to the finance page. And over here, it says budget. You want to click on budget. And it will bring up the budget book for you to review. And this illustration shows the 18-19 budget, but the 2021 budget will be the one that will be front and center and available for folks to identify easily and select. With that being said, I have consumed a big chunk of your time. I appreciate the opportunity to do so. One aspect of clarity is that in our conversations earlier, there's an interest in us making sure that in the future that we identify and look at the budget breakdown, not necessarily by the perspective of programmatic or function programs, but in a way that's departmental in nature. And that certainly is my goal next year, to provide that information in that manner so that we can look at, I think that Trustee Turner had mentioned looking at it in terms of expense centers rather than in terms of programmatic, will be the manner in which we'll start those conversations next year. So to the degree that we failed to do that this year, I take ownership of that and I apologize. But I do appreciate the time, opportunity, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
I think, I was going to start with Trustee Green. Go ahead. If you,
No, that's okay. I can wait my turn.
let's do that. Go ahead. Trustee Green, with any questions you may have.
So I realize that I am the only one here who's been through one of these processes before. So a lot of this is familiar. So I don't have as many questions as most of you probably do. But, Brian already answered one of my questions about, the attempts made to trim the budget. Oh, where was it? I wrote one down as I was going to, but as far as what we approve, the budget book that we see here in the board packet is what is sent to the state, correct?
Actually, we don't provide the budget book to the state. I provide a budget report to the state. And what it does is it breaks down the information in the manner that you see that we looked at earlier in regards to the programs. And then under those programs, that's where you get the salaries and the benefits and the purchase services and the supplies. So we're not actually required by the state to provide a budget book or publish a budget book. Many districts don't. It's been the history to do so here. But we do provide a budget, what they call the budget report to the state. So it'll contain all this information just broken down in that similar type of code, if you will.
Okay. Everything looks, similar to what I've seen before, so nothing out of question for me. I appreciate you putting together all that stuff, all the parts of it, and I did see, questions from other trustees regarding maybe seeing something in a different format next year, and I appreciate that, you're willing to offer that for us in the future. So thanks for all this work together, or all this work you put together on the budget. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Green. Trustee Stone?
Hi. So Brian, I'm confused about, you're referring to the spreadsheet that you just walked us through as the budget book, but then I have on my screen the budget book board packet, which included all the narratives and FTE stuff. And what I spent the last 4 days reviewing 133 pages of is not what you presented tonight. And so I'm confused about, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
So I'm confused about what the board book is. Is the board book that what we were given to review, or is that what you went over tonight? That's my starting question.
Sure. So the budget book is something that we put together for the board's consumption, but also for the public's consumption. It's posted on the website, and it has, as you pointed out, that more than 100 pages of material. Inclusive in there is a lot of the items that we looked at tonight, but also narratives that are provided from departments and from schools for their goal sets or descriptions of their school, et cetera, for next year. So what I have done in this presentation, I've referenced the budget book only from the perspective, and forgive me for confusing what I presented here tonight and the budget book. These are really meant to be two separate things. The material tonight is inclusive of a number of things, or a lot of things that you will find in the budget book, but it's meant to be a supplement or a conversation budget presentation for tonight, not to be representative of the entire budget book. For folks to really get a full gist of the budget book and understand that they really need to go to the website and start at the top and work their way through it, all the way through the executive summary, some of the numeric data, the FTE data for schools, the budget narratives, treatments on the special funds, and then each of those line items that I presented in the earlier tab here, where we looked at each of the programmatic line items in each of the budget categories.
So I think what was difficult for me going through the budget book that was posted, which we've had some back and forth with emails about, but that I would just like to explain one more time. There were, I think it was 72 pages basically of narratives about different departments, and most of them were just copied from last year, so it wasn't any new information that contributed to our understanding of a budget that was being put through now. And so I felt like I spent a lot of time on that, and yet what you're presenting here is actually would have been much more helpful to review, because it was the numbers of what was going on. So I feel like I've spent a lot of time on this already, and I haven't had an opportunity to actually process the numbers that we need to go through. And in particular, because the narratives were the first 70 pages of the board packet, I was thinking about it and understanding what the needs were. I thought, even though I guess most of it was kind of the same as last year, but I was thinking of it in the department, in the sense of each department, and see the numbers relating to programs, which I didn't understand who was in what program or how those broke out. I just feel like I haven't really had a chance to evaluate the information in the time that we had. So, I mean, the kinds of things that I would still like to see before trying to vote on this, I would like to get, what I kind of had expected was to get something from each department head that they had prepared that explained what changes they see in the next year. Yeah, something brief, a one-page thing, and their breakdown of expenses that they had. I presume they prepare something and provide it to you. I think that's what you said earlier. So I don't know if it's possible to give us another week or so to look this over and to actually get from each department an explanation of what their expenses are that they expect to spend, and some of their words about what they see changing in the next year. Maybe it's not much. Maybe it's a change in personnel. I don't know. And then for us to be able to see on the department level or the expense level, what those expenses look like, would be really helpful.
So
is that a possibility?
I'm sorry, I missed that last part.
So is that a possibility?
Well, everything's a possibility from the perspective of the time that we have. The statute allows 14 days past the budget hearing, which is tonight, in which the board must act. So between now and that particular point in time, statutorily, you have the time to do that. One of the challenges is that we've never necessarily defined the budget narrative or the narratives to be aligned with the budgets that they present. They talk about goals, they talk about efforts, they talk about students. Some of them reference numbers, some of them reference their budget, but the direct connection between those narratives and then the budgets that they provide, I think you'll find them more aligned with operational narratives, but not as aligned with the school narratives. And the school narratives are focused more on the programmatic educational efforts rather than the financial efforts that you'll find that the operations folks focus more on.
Yeah, so, I think it was confusing to have kind of the academic focus in the budget.
Yeah, so in defense of my peers out there, I would only ask that the aspect of circling back around to them to tie something together now at this later time and change the rules on them in regards to what we're expecting from them in regards to these narratives. It might be a little unfair to them, given that some of them are working on hiring. Some of them are working on trying to get out of town because some of them are coming off contract.
You did say that each of them prepared a budget. Can you just forward to us what they sent you? I mean, was it that easy if they've each done that?
Yeah, it's similar. I forwarded to you last night, the budget that, or crafted something for some of those subcomponents that was part of district administration and like business ops. But they fill out or complete a spreadsheet that's similar to that it has each of the various line items that are affiliated with their budgets, and then they complete the amount. So let's just say we give them $100,000, and this is after the 5% cut. They will work their way down, their way down in filling in these various line items to provide the amount of funding for each of those particular line items. And so I do have those spreadsheets I'd be happy to share with you.
Yeah, so if they've each done that, that sounds like the work has already been done, and that's something that could be forwarded to us.
Yeah, that's something I can provide to you.
Any other questions, Trustee Stone?
That's all I have right now.
Trustee Larna?
I just have one. Thank you first, Brian, for taking the time to meet with me earlier today to kind of go over through some of this and then answering to my emails. Sorry about that. First, my dog, as soon as they take it off me. I do have one quick question in regards to the property taxes. Is there a way for us to communicate as we move forward with the county and kind of what we're bringing in and what that looks like? So we're not waiting till the very end to decide or, to hear what our revenue will be from that.
Yes, yeah, we can communicate with the county and talk to them and get a gist of how property taxes are rolling in.
Do we do that already or not really?
Not usually. No, we haven't actually. To be honest with you, that's not something we haven't done because the economic environment in 2008 had presented some real challenges. But actually, what we've seen over the course of the last couple of years, this year included, right up to the COVID-19, in which we'll see what happens in July. But we were actually catching up, or I should say, many of our property owners were catching up on past due payments. So rather than seeing a 99%, we were seeing a 99.9% or even 100.01%. So we were actually in a robust place here recently. Mm-hmm. So there really wasn't a need for those conversations, but certainly as we move forward, we can talk with the county to see how receipts are coming in and see what that window during that window of time frame to get an idea of how things are tracking.
Mm-hmm. All right. It was just, yeah. All right. Thank you again for everything. I appreciate it. And all the department heads and everybody that puts time into this.
Yes. Thank you.
Trustee Turner?
Your mic's off.
Mike?
There, I'll get used to this. Trust me. I just want to follow up on Trustee Larna's. Well, I'm very a lot of gratitude towards you, Brian, for the time you've spent in the last week getting me up to speed on these things. We've had a couple of lengthy meetings, and I always find them incredibly informative and it's, there's a steep learning curve for a guy that was just sworn in 2 hours ago. So I'm going to try to kind of encapsulate the way I'm thinking about this. There's obviously a lot to think about, and I kind of sometimes go from 30,000 feet down to the ground, and so kind of bear with me here. But so I think it's obvious we need to address the serious challenge of matching rising expenses and community expectations surrounding what we deliver as a school district. We have to match those with revenues from property taxes that have been fixed since the 2006 stabilization. And now we're seeing a significant decline in support from the state of Idaho. So that combined, I think, we're in a period that calls for extreme budgetary prudence. I mean, I couldn't say it, I couldn't feel anything more full than that it's, a time for extreme prudence. We talked about funding stability, and I'm all for providing the funds for stability, but I'm also think we need to stay in line with, what we can afford. That's the bottom line is we need to be able to afford what we're doing here. I look at, our duty as a trustee, and it's, guiding principle number 4 is to maintain a balanced budget. And a budget that requires a $3.7 million draw from reserve funds, to me, is not a balanced budget. A balanced budget is one where revenues match expenses. It's obvious that that's not possible in certain scenarios, and I think we're probably looking at that sort of scenario. So, end of the day, no matter what we do with this, I don't think we can characterize it as a balanced budget. It's a budget where we clearly had to dip into savings that we have accrued over previous periods. Another concept that I'm kind of struggling with is, and forgive me, I have not had much experience in school accounting, but we seem to consider a beginning balance as a revenue item. I look at a beginning balance as a savings. It's like what was in the bank, the first day of the period, and what I earn after that is a revenue. What was in the bank at the first day of the period is not a revenue, but really a balance carried over. So I struggle with that concept of balances versus revenues. And then the next question is kind of on process. We're being presented a budget, and we're going to be asked to vote up or down on it, I believe. So if it were the case, I'm going to be hypothetical here. If it were the case that we thought there needed to be $1 million trimmed out of this budget, what methodology would we as trustees have if that were our intent at this point in time?
So to answer that question, that if you were looking for, as trustees, another $1 million to be carved out of this, the district would then go back and start looking more robustly at those reductions and where we could target those reductions. One of the challenges that we face is that in some ways in our process, we start approving or we start putting certified contracts together to send out to staff for signature actually prior to the budget approval. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's something that we need to change in the future. But the reasoning behind that is that we try to get contracts in teachers' hands before they actually leave for the end of the school year because of the logistics of having that delivered to them when they're away for the summer and then getting those returned. We find that there's more consistency and continuity in having the principal hand that to them at the school site, have them sign and hand back. Now, instead of chasing 300 contracts, we're chasing, maybe 2 or 3. And that number 2 or 3 is a legitimate number that Jeff had shared with me.
Yeah, I can certainly appreciate that particular aspect of the process. But going back to the hypothetical, if we were to say to you, and again, this is not a recommendation, this is a hypothetical. We need you to cut $1 million out of this. Are you guys operating under that 2-week clock that we've started ticking with the first presentation, or what? How it seems that would be incredibly chaotic. So my question is, then, if it was our intent to make that kind of seismic shift in cuts and so forth, where in the process could we bring that discussion up as trustees? So where is that division between the trustees' desires and the implementation of putting together a budget versus the staff's responsibility? It seems like there are a lot of decisions that were made that went into this budget, and I'm wondering at what point do the trustees have the ability and the public input to say if we're again, I'm looking at a going forward situation where I think we can count on state revenue continue to decline. We got uncertain future for future plant and facility levies, and we've got a stabilization levy that has less buying power each year. So I think there's a need to really look at some big things here. We got 81% of the budget is of course taken up by salaries and benefits. Obviously that's the biggest piece, and that would be something we'd have to look at. But again, we've already offered contracts to most of these people at this point, so we can't really go back in there. So again, if we were in a world where we had to make these big changes, when would we make them? Obviously, we can't make them between tonight and 2 weeks from tonight. When would we have the opportunity to make those changes?
That's actually a great question. The first juncture in time would be back in January when we started talking with the board about those budget guidelines or principles. And in that principle, if one of them is, the balanced budget is always a goal. To your point, a balanced budget in one person's mind may not necessarily include dipping into reserves. And I think that's a fair way of looking at what a balanced budget is. New reserves or new revenues coming in should match the expenses going out with reserves set off to the side. And maybe that becomes one of the budget guidelines or one of the budget principles that the board directs administration as we start working on our budget to start formulating the parameters or the aspect of reductions. And then at that point, we'd start looking at staffing and programs and supply budgets and just a universal review of the budget in a whole. And then when we start coming back in April and May, particularly in May, under a normal year, I would be having this conversation that we presented tonight in our May board meeting. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's a little tough because the timing on this is challenged by when we engage in negotiations and complete that process. And then the second piece is when the legislature finishes its work and then hands that down, and then the intent language is provided by the state to districts on what their funding or their revenue source is revenue funding for that next year is going to look like. This particular year ended up being one of those years where almost everything conspired against. I'm not going to complain as districts because it's conspiring against all entities out there, but we ended up with an environment where in late May we were talking about that preliminary budget review, when we would usually do that on that second Tuesday in May. And it may not be a perfect budget, but it's an opportunity at that particular point in time to really evaluate the reductions that we're looking at, the revenues that are coming in to match those reductions or the other way around. And so that conversation really starts earlier than the process in this particular year afforded us. Mm-hmm. We get kind of constricted or contracted in this late May time period. As late as the governor was in handing out the 5% holdback, I'm very appreciative of the fact that it wasn't in July when statutorily he can actually have the authority to do that. He gave us a roadmap to work with in May rather than in July. Mm-hmm. So a number of events have conspired to make this a more challenging year, but typically as we progress through that budget process, we would be having these conversations sooner. In fact, right out the gate in regards to what the board's expectations are by formulating those guidelines. Mm-hmm. And then we'd be presenting ideas and options. And in May, we have a whole lot of opportunity between then and maybe a special meeting before the budget hearing to get some direction from the board and then return in a special meeting in May where we talk about those things before we're handing out contracts. Mm-hmm. In fact, it's always, it would be recommended, maybe next year we start talking about, and we do talk about a high level formulation of what this is looking like in April. We really didn't get that opportunity because we knew there was going to be some kind of holdback or some kind of reduction. And the legislature, well, they beat it out of town pretty quick. We just didn't know what that legislative intent was going to be without having governor guidance in regard to that holdback. But typically, we would have more time than this to have these conversations, be directed in where we're going to reduce our expenses. Because frankly, as we talked about in the general fund, with 82% of that budget being people, it's very difficult to make consequential reductions in all the other areas, many of which, again, unless you're closing schools, reducing utilities in a very significant consequential manner can be challenging. Mm-hmm. We have more time for more direction and more reaction.
I appreciate that. That's and again, this is probably just my ignorance of the process being so new to it. Could you kind of explain what you think the role of a standing finance committee of the board would or of the public would play in this role? I mean, I did serve on that finance committee from the fall of 2018 through the discussions about the plant facilities levy, and then we were kind of I don't know if we were disbanded. We just weren't asked to do anything beyond that. What could you see a role for a finance committee populated by board and public members to to work to have a role in the budgetary process?
Certainly. Yeah, usually finance committees, at least as it pertains to school districts, and my observations or experiences usually formulate into two goals. And that first goal being the one that you just described, in which there is an evaluation in regards to revenues and levies. Does the levy make sense? Is there justification for this? And how much would we raise? And what would be the goals associated with the funds that to be spent on the funds that we do raise? Mm-hmm. Certainly, the second one would be to work and look at the district's fiscal picture as we go along and talk about where we might make reductions for an upcoming budget year. How are we trending relative to the budget that's in place? Mm-hmm. In the private sector, in some ways, it's sort of like an audit committee that might be assembled to track how the budget is unfolding over the given course of that year, and that would include, it could potentially include one, certainly up to but no more than two board members, unless they wanted to hold an actual board meeting with a quorum of three. Community members, other members within the district, such as a member from the BCEA, another administrator. So there's a couple of different ways that these committees can be structured in regards to how they look at and advise on in regards to the district's finances.
I just believe the amount of intellectual horsepower that resides within this community is something that I think is ready to be tapped into when we're facing, which I believe will be some very serious decisions in the next couple of years when it comes to how we manage this district. So that would just be my hope would be somehow to harness that horsepower and get them inside the tent looking out rather than outside looking in.
Well, you and I had a conversation in one of our finance committee meetings, and I scribbled down a note there that said Dan's idea. No. Dan's idea was to utilize aspects of members in the community that have some financial experience to come in and evaluate and make a determination in regards to how the district is treating its funds and the appropriateness of the use of those funds. And I still have that piece of paper, and I still have that reminder, and it's still something that I find that would be interesting and of merit to pursue as we move forward.
I certainly appreciate it, and I'm sorry I take up so much time, but thank you again for all your help in understanding all this.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate your time.
Brian, I don't want to get into a legal argument here by any means, but do I hear you saying that the board could not at this point veto a line item? I didn't mean for that question to knock you off.
It can make changes to it and pass it. It can postpone that for up to 2 weeks.
I understand that, but 33801, I think, makes it absolutely clear that it is in fact the budget, or the board of trustees is responsible for preparing the budget. We have your expertise, and we're very glad to have that, and we have the input and the guidance from the superintendent. I appreciate that. And perhaps I was listening less clearly than I should have, but I take the position that you have offered us a budget which is being recommended by the staff, and that is as it should be. But if when we vote on that budget, we decided that we wanted to cut the amount of supplies, for instance, that are budgeted for by $500,000, we could do that, correct?
That is accurate, yes. If I in any way conveyed a message that suggested otherwise, that was not my intent. The board is at liberty to pass the budget that it sees fit. To your point, that we present this as a recommendation and a structure of a budget, but it is ultimately the board's decision whether they take that, modify it, or do something completely different.
I just want to underline, if I could, what Dan has said, because it certainly mirrors my feelings. I don't believe in slashing budgets just to be slashing budgets. And I think when you try to squeeze out the last cup of coffee and the last donut that a committee gets to enjoy while they're spending 3 hours working on school business, that just becomes ridiculous as far as I'm concerned. But we're facing the fact that we are, in fact, dealing now with an unbalanced budget. We are eating into $3.5 million worth of our reserves. To me, that mandates that we look now, not next year, but that we look right now for any place that we can legitimately save money by cutting services, personnel, departments, whatever, that are not essential to achieving the mission of the district itself. And I think the mission always has to come back to student achievement. And we have to look at that budget in terms of what is each dollar doing to contribute to an increased level of achievement on the part of students. And you're absolutely right. I mean, for next year, I think we need by January, if not earlier, to sit down and really give a hard look at what we're doing and why we're doing it. But I may be prepared to make some proposals that we make some cuts in the budget when we vote on it. And I didn't want anybody to be unclear as to our authority to do that.
Yes, my point to Trustee Turner was that, cutting $1 million may have some challenges in regards to some of the expenses and personnel that have become fixed with the signature of contracts. That does not mean that the board is not statutorily able to do those things. They absolutely are. They're at liberty to do those things.
Well, we have signed the master agreement. I signed the master agreement on behalf of the Board of Trustees with the BCEA. So certainly for the coming year, we would not be able to cut personnel or personnel salaries or anything that's contained in either their contract or the master agreement. I understand that, and I wasn't really talking about a mandate in which we say we want $1 million cut out of the budget before we pass it. But I think we do have discretion, and we may and probably should use that discretion. As to my question, I've really only got one here, Brian, and I think it is on about page 75. It refers to the Instructional Improvement Program. Are you there with me?
So page 75, let me see if I can find that here.
I think it's, yeah, 75. Instructional Improvement Program. And under salaries, it reads, salaries include paying staff members for developing curriculum during the summer months. The curriculum director, program coordinator, and data and assessment coordinator. Last year, apparently, that was $689,000. This year, it's $435,000. I didn't really understand that. Is that supplemental pay in addition to what those three administrators are currently earning?
So in the salaries portion, the 435 represents the director, the program coordinator, I'm sorry, not the program coordinator, the data and assessment coordinator, and their admin assistant. There's some stipends that are noted in there for some of that summer month work. There was the individual who's the program coordinator for this particular fiscal year. I moved that individual out of that particular line item, which makes up the majority of the reduction there, into a special ed or a special ed account. And the reason for that is that each year by federal guidelines, we have to spend as much in the ensuing year as we did in the current year. So with our reductions that we had implemented, I needed to move that person, that special ed director, over to that particular line item so that our budget was actually greater next year marginally than it was in our current 1920 year.
And if I could just add on.
Let me ask the questions, okay? And then we'll have the response if we could. We do have a curriculum director, although I believe her title has changed, correct?
That is accurate.
And we have a data and assessment coordinator as well, correct?
Yes, I believe she's the special programs director now.
No, we still have a data and assessment coordinator. We do not have a program coordinator anymore. We combined that with student services director. And so 2 different jobs became one.
Well, if I go to the administrative contracts, look at the contracts of the administrators, I am going to find a contract for the program coordinator, whatever that title might now be, the data and assessment coordinator, and the curriculum director, who now has a different title.
Correct, but you will not find a contract for the student services director.
Well, however that may be, what I'm asking is this. Are you saying that the contract, the amount of salary that is paid and reflected in the contract that is on file and open to the public does not include what you are referring to as a stipend?
The stipend in this line item, I believe, Brian, correct me, is stipends we pay to teachers and other folks who are off contract to work during the summer in helping develop curriculum, stuff like that. The stipend does not go to the administrators.
That's accurate.
This is a school district where we teach English, we teach composition, and this says salaries include paying staff members for developing director or curriculum during the summer months, the curriculum director, program coordinator, data and assessment coordinator. When I read that, it sounds like we are paying them the stipend. Otherwise, why are they named in that sentence?
You're correct. The sentence could be better written, that's for sure.
Well, I'm charged with the responsibility of presenting a budget, and I don't know how I present a budget when I am told that there is $435,704 that has been allocated for paying staff members during the summer, and those include the curriculum director, program coordinator, data and assessment coordinator. I don't understand that.
Nope, that needs updated.
That's my only question. All right, any other questions? But yes, Trustee Stone.
I agree with Chairman Rourke that with the budget the way that we are right now, especially after just spending all that time negotiating with the BCEA, we owe it to everybody in the district to take a very close look at the budget and where money is being spent and make sure that we feel comfortable that we're spending money in all the places that we are. And the way that it's been presented, it's hard for me to tell where it's being spent, and I'm not comfortable voting on it right now. And I think we should be looking at this to make reductions. We've asked our staff to make some sacrifices for this, and I don't feel good about everything we asked of them if we aren't looking at this and also looking for any cuts that we can make. And I would argue that they've been real minimal so far. And I support that to some extent because student achievement is really important. But if there are cuts that we can make other than that, I think it's something that we really need to take a look at. And I don't see how we can do that tonight. I would really like at least another week to get that information about the different departments, understand what we're spending in each of them, understand, have the information that actually tells us who's in those budgets, what their actual title is so that we understand how it ties out with salary schedules. If someone has moved from one to another, that we can understand that better. I would prefer to wait a week and have some more information so that we can make a better educated decision about this and know that we've looked at it carefully.
Madam Clerk, are you still with us?
Yes, I am.
We have, I'm going to declare that the budget hearing itself is concluded. We have a public comment section. Did we receive any comment via email on the budget?
I did not.
Okay. Here's what I propose to do. I want the public to be able to make comment following tonight's hearing. I think there's additional information that we need to have. I also need additional time to consider what's in this budget and whether or not I think it meets our fiscal responsibilities. So I would like to call a special meeting for next Thursday. I will give staff time to come up with the additional information we're requesting, give the public an opportunity to provide via email again their comments in regard to that budget, and then we can go about the business of passing a budget.
On Thursday the 18th?
Pardon me?
Thursday the 18th? Is that what you're looking at?
Well, if that's the number, yeah. Next Thursday, not this Thursday.
Yeah,
Next
good.
Thursday. Let me ask the trustees. Trustee Green, is that me with your approval?
I'm fine with that. I don't think anybody should have to vote on something they're uncomfortable with voting on without following ordinance. So,
Trustee Stone?
I'd like that. I approve.
Trustee Lorna?
I agree. I think that we should wait.
Trustee Turner?
Oh, your mic's off.
Your mic's off.
I too would welcome the opportunity to have a little more time to not only hear from the public on this, but get myself more solid. You go into every class wanting to be an A student, and I think I'd get about a C- on the budget at this point, and I would enjoy a little extra time. Thank you.
All right. Madam Clerk, if you go about the business of setting the time for the hearing, week from Thursday, that will be, what did you say, Trustee Stone? That's the 18th?
Right.
All right, go ahead. And you had a comment there, Trustee Stone?
I did have one more request. I thought what Brian presented today was really helpful. And I wondered if it was possible for him to also provide that for the following budget, if he can, whatever, not to spend a bunch of time on it, but whatever he could just turn into a PDF would be great, and post it, or a spreadsheet, whatever.
Yeah, technically it should be posted as a part of the board packet.
And it's supposed to be posted at the offices as well. That's fine. I'll let the clerk and whomever take care of that. That's part of their responsibility.
That'd be great.
And Brian, I hope you don't misinterpret what I'm saying here. I very much appreciate what you've done and what you're doing. This is not a criticism of you by any means. It's not a criticism. I think that we need to revamp this process. I think we owe it to the people who pay the taxes, the students who depend upon us, and their parents, to look at the money we're spending with a really careful eye. Frankly, this format that the state has foisted upon us doesn't permit me to do that. But please don't leave the meeting tonight thinking you have been chastised. You have not.
Agreed.
Thank you for the comments. I appreciate them.
Consequently, going to defer consideration of the 2021 budget until a special meeting next week. So let's move to our consent agenda. The first matter is a consideration of the minutes. Have all board members had an opportunity to the minutes? Madam Clerk, we did have minutes, did we not, on that very short meeting last week when we showed our wisdom by appointing Trustee Turner to the board?
Correct.
Okay. Has everyone received those minutes?
Yes.
All right, then I'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes unless there are amendments, additions, or deletions.
Trustee Green, was there that one?
So I'm not sure how much Trustee Stone really wants to be, related to me, but apparently I earned a new last name. I think it's the 522 minutes. Maybe not. Let me find which one it does. I became trustee Kelly Stone somehow.
Well, I like to keep things interesting.
Yeah, that was the only thing I found. But I mean, that's just a quick change. That doesn't mean, that doesn't change any of the, intents of the motions that are listed in the minutes. So that's just a quick edit.
Page 1 of the June minutes, that's all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll go fix it.
So I'll entertain a motion to approve with that correction.
So moved.
I'll second.
Any discussion? There being none, I'll call the question. All in favor of approving the minutes will signify by saying aye.
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 Those opposed, the ayes have it. The minutes are approved. Acceptance of the monthly financial reports. I have all of the trustees had an opportunity to review those materials.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Are there any questions that arise in your review of those?
I had one, but Brian answered them already.
Yeah, and same with me. I was just going to state there were some late fees on the credit card I had asked Brian about, and Laura had the same question. It sounds like he reached out to them. It was during COVID when everybody had to kind of race out, so we didn't get it paid in time, but he did reach out to them asking for maybe, hopefully they can reverse those fees. And I'm surprised that they charged them just doing, during all of that. But
All right.
I got one comment, Mr. Chairman. There's a heck of a lot of information there. I mean, that seems like a data dump of very, pretty extreme. Is there any way going forward to be presented with more of a kind of a key indicators, maybe a statement of, so that we don't quite, I understand the someone's need for that level of granularity, but it just seems it's quite daunting to try to get through all of that. But just my comment as a newcomer.
My law professor in Property One commented from time to time that you don't get to start over. You're stuck with what we got. Trustee Stone and Tuesday, I'd love to go through that. So.
Point taken. Thank you.
And Dan, just so you know, we had asked for a little bit more information kind of coming on so we could go through some of that. Laura and I both did, but maybe, just trying to save Brian time, but, maybe a synopsis of everything. And then, because we did ask for the credit card bills and stuff like that.
We asked for the credit card bills, which was good. I also have talked to Brian about trying to come up with some reports that are more summary instead of that level of detail, but higher level, and maybe comparing different terms, time periods. And that's something that I know he's been working on. So I think that's something we can continue working with him on. I think that would help us with our review a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Brian, you might be able to explain, when I was going through these, did I miss the one that usually has your revenues and expenditures compared from your budgeted revenues to actual revenues? Did I miss something in there, or was that not there?
I'll have to go back and take a look. Typically, if you're referring to the one with the bar graph, and
It's June.
yeah, June and July, we don't usually provide that just because the data isn't in a complete picture because of deferred revenues and expenses.
Okay, that's what I think. I remember you saying something about that in the past, so I just wanted to make sure I was in the right state of mind with that. So,
all right. Any comments, questions about the monthly financial reports? If not, I'll entertain a motion to approve the same.
I move we approve the monthly financials.
I'll second that.
Any discussion? Hearing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Those opposed? The ayes have it. Those monthly financial reports are approved. The next item is the consideration of personnel exiting and entering. Dr. Holmes, let me ask you a question here. Is there a difference when I look at the departing personnel? Sometimes the notation is retiring, and sometimes it's resigning.
Yes.
is there a difference between those normally?
Yes. Two of the folks, as you can see there, are retiring, so they are declaring their career done, at least for the moment. Lots of times they change their minds, but declaring their career done and filling out paperwork to begin drawing their retirement funds. Two of those on that list are moving away, and one is hopefully going to come back someday, just going to be home for a little while with a baby.
All right. And we also have in that same report I'm going to call them the new hires or the proposed new hires.
Mm-hmm.
Are we keeping up pretty well in terms of replacing departing personnel with new personnel?
Fairly well. We maybe have struck gold and found a Spanish-speaking social worker. References are being checked. And
That's wonderful.
You know, that Spanish-speaking component is always the hard part. So I believe there's still one. We need a Spanish speaker for a kindergarten class, I believe, still. I'm just going off the top of my head, but I think that's accurate. And then we have a few other teaching positions as well, but they're not quite as hard to fill.
Okay. Any questions from members of the board as regards the exiting and entering personnel?
I had a question, and this kind of goes along with what Keith or Chairman Rourke had asked, is what percentage of, when we have somebody leave, how often is that position filled by somebody within district as opposed to somebody new coming outside of the district? That could come later. It doesn't have to be now, but that's just information as I would be
on vacation this week, so that would be something we'd have to ask her if she could even data mine for that. I know she's trying to track things going forward.
Mm-hmm.
But I'd have to ask her if she can data mine backwards on that. And there certainly is a domino effect at this time of the year and I really actually am pretty glad to see it, because if you're doing the same thing forever and ever, sometimes it gets a little stale. So teachers will say, oh, I think I would like to switch to this grade or to this school and try something new. And it's refreshing to them as professionals. So there's a lot of that. And then there's the filling behind.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? This is an action item, so I'll entertain a motion to approve the statement of exiting and entering employees.
I move that we approve the exiting and entering personnel request.
I'll second that.
Moved and seconded. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, I'll call a question. All those in favor of approving the personnel exiting and entering list will signify by saying aye.
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 Those opposed, ayes have it. That is in fact approved. Dr. Holmes, do you want to give us just a little bit of background on this indemnity agreement with the City of Haley?
Sure. This is the traditional fireworks that the City of Haley or the chamber puts on, and they use the community campus, Wood River High School campus area for their drop zone. So they're shooting off there kind of in the street parking lot area of Wood River High School, and all around that is the drop zone. And so this allows them to do that. We've gotten smarter over the years, and they've gotten smarter with us. They now close off the lots and patrol it so that we don't have quite so much people in danger or trashing of the property, and then they clean it up in time for the community campus to open this year. Because it's a weekend, they've got a little more time to clean it up. But it basically just says that we'll hold each other harmless in this, allowing them to shoot fireworks off there.
So if one of the fireworks goes through the window of the community campus, we have waived any liability?
Or
Do we have any liability? No, they have liability.
All right. And do we require that, do we not?
Yes.
Okay, great. Any questions about this agreement?
I'd just like to say I'm glad we have it because last year Jerome High School's roof caught on fire due to fireworks being shut off. So, it is something that's really nice to have.
Well, and just to give some assurance, we had a custodian on the roof last year and firefighters from the city there. So they're watching for those kinds of things. Hopefully we won't follow Jerome's path.
Great. Other comments, questions? Hearing none, then I'll entertain a motion that we approve the indemnification agreement with the city for the fireworks display.
So moved.
I'll second.
Moved and seconded. Any further discussion? Hearing none, I'll call the question. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Ayes have it. That agreement is approved. Dr. Holmes, you talked to me earlier this afternoon, I think Vice Chair Green as well, about this next item. Could we have just a little bit of background? We do have a lot of new members on the board, and it may not be clear why we ever pay Minidoka County to
All right, so that little finger of Blaine County that sticks down and goes all the way to the river, we have traditionally had a few students living down there that if we were to put them on a bus and bring them up here would be an exorbitant amount of time on a bus. So they have traditionally chosen to go to the Minidoka schools, and so then there's been a tuition exchange or transportation exchange. One family down there that had multiple children, their last child graduated last year, and then the other family that was down there moved away. So we don't owe them any money this year. This could also happen and has happened in the past if we had families living in over Galena, on the north side of Galena. If they choose to go but still in Blaine County, they could either bring their kids over the pass every day to school, or they could choose to go to Stanley and then to Chalice, and we would do the same there. And it's very common for districts all over Idaho to do that when people are in remote places.
Any questions? Since this is a school, yes, go ahead, Trustee Stone.
I'm just confused because the superintendent said that we didn't have to do any money, but it says $1,512 on the agenda, and I'm just wondering why there's an amount on the agenda.
Oh, I don't know. Brian, can you help us with that? Brian talked to their business manager today and asked where the bill was, and they told him that the students had moved. Brian, do you know anything more?
So we thought that was how much it was, but now we don't think we need to pay it. Is that the deal?
That's my understanding.
I see. Okay.
Brian, are you there?
Brian left. No, I'm kidding. No.
I'm sorry, there it is. My unmute mute button didn't want to turn unmuted. So the 1,500 was the amount that we paid last year, and the expectation of what we might pay this year. But a number of the students that are down there are with migrant families, and so they ended up leaving the area. The farmer who was down there as a consistent resident, his children all grew up and graduated. I believe the last one, the youngest, graduated last year. So we could see some transition in regards to families at some point next year with the migratory pattern of some of the workers down there. But at least for next year, for this request, it was a $0 sum.
But I do want to take a moment to point out a cost savings we found here when we were going through this incredible budget cutting over the last couple of years. We used to have a bus and a bus driver down there that we paid to take those couple kids to school.
Oh, wow.
Instead of paying Minidoka to come get them. And it's like the distance is like 7 miles.
So that's the one that's down in my zone, is that correct?
Yes, it's way down there in that southern finger on the other side of the lava beds.
Yeah, I don't know what you're talking, but they voted.
Yes, they do vote.
Yeah, they voted for the I was like, what? So, okay, I was just wondering if that was.
Yes.
It's a, pre-
It's usually listed,
it's a precinct called Yale.
yes, I was going to say, it's usually listed as Yale.
And,
Okay, thank you. Okay.
and now, because this is a school board, this is the history question of the month. Vice Chair Green, do you know why we have that long finger that goes all the way down a minute ago?
Is it water rights or is it railroad?
It's the railroad.
Yeah, I knew it was either one or the other. Railroad and water rights, so I figured.
Minidoka County, Lincoln County, Blaine County, Gooding County all used to be at one time, a long time ago, Altura County. And when they started chipping off the pieces, everybody wanted a piece of the railroad because they paid the highest taxes.
Yeah.
So that's the remainder of that part of Alturas County. We got it, and now the railroad doesn't produce any income anymore.
Yeah.
But they vote for Amber, so what the hell?
Yeah, hey, there's some property out there along, like, what, 2, 3
All right,
years
so
ago?
we can take that off the agenda. We have public comment listed there. And I'm wondering, let me move things around if we could.
Chairman Mark, you missed one item,
We still have the tenant waiver.
or the rent waiver.
Yes, indeed. And I think we've gone over this previously. But if you want to explain it again very, very concisely, Dr. Holmes, please do.
Actually, I'm going to toss it to Brian because he's the one who keeps track of our leases over there.
He deferred to you because he knows that I failed to be concise in very many things. So, and I will endeavor to try to be very concise on this.
That's quite okay. I sometimes enjoy your encyclopedic approach.
So the attachment there is actually inclusive of real or actual numbers for the May time period. When we talked about this in our previous board meeting, the ask was for a waiver of the rent for the second half of March, the entire month of May, and then the entire month of April and the first half of May. At the time that we presented this, we did have March and April numbers. And since Blaine County Rec District and CSI, they participate in a proportional share of utility costs and custodial costs, we didn't have those utility costs. Now that those are in, the numbers that are in blue, in green, I can share with you are the fixed numbers that we would be asking for the month of May for those two particular partners. And it is less than we had projected. We had thought that number might be around 10,000, so it's around 6,000. So the entire ask for each of the members or partners that are listed above would be that 35,009 number. And that would be inclusive of the 2 partial months and the full month. So that's what we're asking for tonight is a motion to provide rent forgiveness for those partners in the total of $35,098.
Any questions of Brian as regards this item?
Yeah, if I could, again, I'm playing catch up on this one. So these are basically like not-for-profits that are our tenants here. And I understand a business who must generate revenues operating their business to pay rent would obviously need some help because their business is impacted. What the sense of these not-for-profits, I mean, they're not charging a customer a day use, and so a walk-up customer wouldn't be impacted if the building's closed or open. So kind of what is, I'm sorry, you've probably been over this before, but so kind of what is the rationale about, other than being a good landlord, giving them the break when I'm not seeing where the closure would necessarily impact their revenues.
So that is, I'm sorry, Trustee Warner.
Oh, no, go ahead. I have a question to add on to that. So go ahead and answer that, Brian, and then I'll ask.
So you pretty much dialed it in when you said just being a good landlord, because we closed the building in association with the governor's order because of that purpose. Not to say that we were definitively denying those particular entities access to the building that they would otherwise be denied by a county order. The idea behind that was to be a good partner and forgive the rent for that period of time. in which we closed the building, which was I believe it was March 16th. And so that's why it's the back half of March and only the front half of May, is because in mid-May, then we opened it back up with certain parameters. So the board had approved opening up within those parameters. I would say that some of those partners were not impacted on a fiscal revenue perspective, but others were. Probably CSI not so much, because they moved or migrated to a modality of being online just like we did. So their ability to continue providing that service, I would say, might have been compromised in terms of its efficacy or its the customer satisfaction of that versus being in-house. But certainly BCRD, a lot of its revenue revolving around the use of the gym there and its daycare program. And forgive me for using that term, Mr. Keating, because I'm not sure that's the term he would use. But those programs were impacted, and there was a loss of revenue, as it was for like Footlight Dance. They lost revenue also. So it is mostly a good neighbor action.
Thank you.
So just a question, kind of, and maybe it's included in the like reopening, but so I went there the other day and it was still pretty closed down. Is that the way we're going to keep it throughout the summer? Is that, or do we have plans on reopening it? What is it going to look like? I know, there were kids outside playing in regards to the BCRD, summer youth program, but do we have any plans in regards to that? Are we going to continue to forgive these, for the remaining of the months?
So in the previous board meeting, the board had, I'll say, was declarative about this is a one-time event, that if there is closure in fall, that they may not be as apt to provide forgiveness for rent. So currently the building is closed to the public. So it's open for partners to have access. Each of those partners have filed with us an indemnity waiver, and then the guidelines that they will be following, and they follow a certain pattern in regards to social distancing and cleaning and things of that nature. So those would be the parameters that they would adhere to. In regards to open the building up and to the general public, maybe that's more of a question to defer to the board in regards to when they will actually make the motion to pass to allow us to open up that building. What the board did was provide us access to allow the partners back in.
Right, yeah. And I guess I was just, when I was in there the other day, I was wondering that, just as safe as we're trying to be in there, making sure, I guess, that we don't, because in the summer, oftentimes in that building, that's like the place to hang out. That's the, kids going and play basketball. So I was just curious if it had been communicated at all with you guys. That's all.
There certainly is an interest.
So at this point, it's shut down.
Yes, correct, to the public. So if you're somebody who drove up and wanted to go do laps, I know sometimes people will, as part of their rehabilitation, like to do laps in that circular area. The building would be close to that particular person. But if you were affiliated with the BCRD, then you would have access, but you would enter through one of the BCRD.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. From what I've seen on the BCRD website, the FitWorks, the actual gym part, is planning on opening the 15th of June. So,
and you would go in through the back. I guess I was just more like worried about the common area, with the kids and all. It was super safe. They were doing it. I guess like do we have any, has it been communicated between like you, Brian, or Gwen Carroll, are we going to stay closed throughout the summer?
As far as schools go, we are closed throughout the summer. So I feel like it would be your call if you wanted us to open to the public before then. That's why we've been pretty selective in who comes in and who doesn't. Especially while we're still in stage 3. Hopefully we're moving to stage 4. And can have larger groups of people. But as a school, we are still under the state board and closed through the summer. So,
yeah. Okay.
Other questions? All right, I'll entertain a motion to approve a rent waiver for the community campus tenants.
I'll make a motion to approve the rent waiver for the community campus tenants.
Do we have
one time, correct? A one-time waiver.
Okay.
I'll second.
All right, moved and seconded. Any further discussion? Hearing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. Ayes have it. The waiver is approved. As we move then to the action agenda, in line with our decision earlier to have our actual budget consideration next Thursday at a special meeting, I would suggest that we probably ought to delay approval of the salary and benefits for administrators until then. I know that may cause a little bit of problem as far as contracts are concerned, but we don't have nearly as many administrators as we do teachers, so I don't think that that's much of a burden. Anybody opposed to that or other thoughts?
Are you talking both administrators and classified, since that's what the item is, or did you want to split it?
I would rather wait on all of it, Dr. Holmes.
Just got to make sure we're on track here.
Sure, unless I don't want to preclude the board members from their own opinions here.
It's fine with me. I'm just trying to make notes.
All right. We will take that matter up then. Madam Clerk, if you'll put that on the action agenda for the special meeting on the 19th, please.
18th.
18th, yes.
The 18th, or
Yeah, the 19th is celebration. Don't tread on their party.
all right then, fine.
Are we doing that at 6 o'clock, just so I can put it on my calendar, same time?
I would say so, yes, please.
Okay, thank you.
All right, we have two approvals, one an engagement letter for the auditor. The other is the Sodexo renewal agreement. Does anyone feel that they need an explanation of why we engage an auditor?
No.
All right, is there any discussion? Well, let's ask someone to make a motion to approve the engagement letter for our auditor and the auditor's review.
Is that the, so we just, I guess we move to approve the engagement letter for the auditor.
I second.
Second. Any discussion, any question? Hearing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor of approving the engagement letter which you have been provided signify by saying aye.
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 And those opposed, ayes have it. That engagement letter is approved. The Sodexo renewal agreement, of course, is for food service. Dr. Holmes or Brian, is there anything special we should know about that?
Yeah, I'll jump in and take this. Essentially, we have originally signed a 5-year agreement with 1-year increments with Sodexo. The conclusion of that first year is upon us. This is the renewal for that second year. As part of the contract, the parameters for an increase in the Sodexo proposal, and I'll just read it real quick. Sodexo's fixed price may be increased on an annual basis by the yearly percentage change in the Consumer Price Index for all urban customers as published by the United States Department of Labor, Bureau of Labor Statistics, food eaten away from home, that particular line item. Since looking at that data from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, most recent data, which is actually August of 2019, so I imagine this will come in the update for the time period that we have been living through will probably be after we make this vote in August of 2020. But that data is 3.2%. What Sodexo has requested is to have it in a 3% increase, and that is predicated upon the Oregon Department of Education. They did a analysis and came to the conclusion that the food away from home and the CPI for their area was 3%. Idaho's Department of Education does not do a calculation since there's only a handful, I think there's 4 or 5 districts that actually contract out for food service. So this is a fairly close proxy that we see, and it's less than it is of the national average, so it seemed as though it was an appropriate amount for that breakfast and lunch price to be adjusted. So our ask tonight is for a motion to allow us to sign the document that is included in the board packet. And when you look at that document, it's the first page discusses the change in the meal price, signature page on that second, and then it goes on to include quite a number of items that, as part of the federal program's requirements for contractors to provide, and then both parties sign. So I'll avoid the invitation or opportunity to discuss each one of those, but it's basically what I'll say is some aspect of legalese that accompanies the renewal. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
So your recommendation is that we go ahead and approve that?
It is. It's in alignment with what our agreement with Sodexo's proposal is.
And if I could just add very quickly that Sodexo in the first semester when we were having school got good reviews on their food. And then once COVID hit, I was very impressed with their ability within 2 days to start pumping out food for students. And at days we were over 900 lunches and 900 breakfasts at some days that we were distributing, and they kept up with it all. So great partner there.
All right. Any questions of Dr. Holmes or Brian?
I just said that I appreciate the comments on the food quality. That's always bottom line, is if this product's any good. But the 3% bump, what is that dollars and cents? I mean, what are we looking at in difference?
Mike.
You.
Oh, God.
You
Oh, you're fine. It's Brian.
Oops.
You were fine.
Okay, I'm sorry. This is the computer where it likes to freeze up, so I apologize for that. So predicated upon roughly $1 million, it'd be about a $30,000 bump.
Any follow?
They do still like the community campus. There's the cafe. Are they there as well?
Yeah, the plan is for that, the previous kitchen that was the community campus cafe, which actually was administered by and managed by both previously, but it was our program that had been modified to become they rent the space just like a partner, if you will, and then they pay us a percentage of that. And so going through the ramp up phase of implementing that cafe, and then with COVID-19, that has actually sort of been put on the back burner. It is still our intent to have the cafe there, and that would be an agreement that is completely separate from the child nutrition. The feds in the state of Idaho don't want those things commingled because they see the opportunity for us to, again, underwrite or use federal dollars to subsidize that activity. So that is actually not a part of this agreement.
Okay, thank you for clarifying.
Yep, thank you.
Any further questions or comments? All right, I'll entertain a motion that we approve the Sodexo renewal agreement.
So moved.
Seconded.
Moved and seconded. Any further discussion? Hearing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor will signify by saying aye.
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 Those opposed, ayes have it. That agreement, the renewal agreement is approved.
Thank you.
Dr. Holmes, if you could edify us a bit on the addition of a teacher workday. It is an action item, so
Okay, so the current calendar that was recently approved only contains 184 teacher workdays. Per their contract, it's 185 days, and I don't think any of them want to give up a day of pay. So we are proposing just to add one more teacher workday on after the last day that's currently on the calendar, so that would be Wednesday, May 26th. We are not proposing to add any student days, just to add another teacher workday. This year they had 3 days at the end of the year, and some of them I know were wondering what they were going to do, and then COVID hit, took care of that problem. So let's hope COVID goes away.
all right, any questions about that of Dr. Holmes?
I just wanted to say that having worked on that calendar, the reason that we moved the third day was just like the superintendent just said, because they didn't think they needed it. It definitely came in handy this year. I think it makes a lot of sense to just add it on to the end and not worry about it.
All right, any further comments or questions?
Any fiscal impact of this?
If we didn't add it on, then we would be in violation of their contract because we'd only be paying them for 184 days instead of 185. So the 185 days of payment is already in the budget.
Okay, appreciate it. Thank you.
Anything further? Then I'll entertain a motion that we approve the addition of a teacher workday to the 2020-2021 calendar.
I move we add a teacher workday to the 2021 calendar.
As Nate seconded.
Moved and seconded. Any further discussion?
Can we add the actual date that you're going to add it? The May 26th, 2021?
Do I have to?
Because otherwise you're just saying it's a teacher workday to the work year and not just a workday.
Can I restate my motion? What do I do now?
Sure, you can withdraw your motion and restate it.
I withdraw my motion and we'll restate it. I move we add a teacher workday to the 2021 calendar on Wednesday, May 26, 2021.
I'll still second it.
Moved and seconded. Any further discussion? All right. All of those in favor of approving the addition of a teacher workday onto the 2020-2021 calendar to be May 26, 2021 will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, ayes have it. That matter is approved. Once again, just to keep with tradition, I'm going to waive my board chair report so that we can move on to Superintendent Holmes' report on our fall reentry planning.
Okay, so all of the documents that I'm going to be referring to are already posted there. The first real quick piece I want to just share with you is the access data. Access is the assessment we are required every year to give to our English learners, and it assesses their reading, writing, speaking, and listening abilities in English. It's part of the state's accountability. The state keeps changing the exit criteria, so it's kind of like trying to compare apples and oranges in that things keep moving around. It appears that we are doing about as well as the previous year. You can see on the tables on the second page the number of kids who stayed the same, moved up to the next level, or even regressed. You can see that kids move fairly quickly through levels 1, 2, and then into 3, and move much slower at levels 4 and 5. And that kind of goes along with the conversation we were having earlier about even teachers who speak a second language. Those first couple of levels are what I call playground English, or it's just conversational English. How do I ask to go to the bathroom? Ask my friend to play, those kinds of things. And then they start getting into academic English. But the piece that really gives me hope is on the very last page. If you look at our performance of our English learners on the ISAT, and the ISAT, remember, is grade level critical thinking skills. So it's not easy for somebody who's just beginning to learn English to do. And we are seeing an upward trend there in both literacy and math as far as students being able to meet proficiency despite being an English learner, and a drop in the number of kids who are below basic, which is the lowest level. So I just want to give a shout out, because that's classroom teachers, co-teachers, you name it. They're working like crazy to make that happen. Then the next thing is the reentry plan. And rather than going through it in detail, I'll just highlight some parts and then you can ask some questions. I did send this out to all staff last Friday, so I know you've heard from a few staff members about it. I was, right before the meeting today, I was reviewing some web pages that will go up either tomorrow or the following day as it's pushed out to all of our families. And there's form in there or a survey that allows them to give us some feedback that we'll use then to compose a Q&A. The main focus of what we're doing is still the same. We're safety of our students and continuing to help all students master priority standards. However, the processes are going to be very different depending on the circumstances. And I want to stress that because we've already got people asking us, how will we know which one it's going to be? Plan A, Plan B, Plan C. And it is a collaborative process between the trustees and myself, the South Central Public Health District, and county government. You know, we have to all work together and talk about this and where we think we need to be in these various plans. But the building leadership team spent the last week of school working on plans within their within their school on how to keep kids in smaller groups and not mix around. So for example, at the elementary level, instead of going to the music room, the music teacher might come to their classroom. So you don't have every kid in the school moving through the music room and sharing germs. Or another example at the high school level, Wood River High School has been quite creative in trying to change their schedule so that the kids are only participating in 4 classes at a time, longer blocks of time during the day, but that reduces them from moving around between 7 classes and 7 teachers. And it should also be helpful to students in reducing the amount of stress that they're dealing with because they're only dealing with 4 classes at a time. It will reduce the caseload for teachers. And if you looked at the survey, you'll see one of the challenges was teachers being able to communicate and especially help with the kids that are struggling, type of thing. Then those plans rolled their way up to the district leadership team where we had to talk about things that would impact district-wide. Let's say the health officials are recommending to us that we truly be social distancing, because there's no way to social distance on a school bus right now. There's 2 or 3 kids in a seat. We will be, at least unless the guidance changes, we will be asking them to wear a mask, but still they're sitting right there. So if they really want us to social distance and have social distancing in classrooms, then we could only have half of the kids at a time just because of space limitations in school buildings and on buses. And so how do we do that without totally turning families upside down? Because we want all of the kids in that family to go on the same day, not have parents trying to handle multiple different schedules. Then that provides all kinds of childcare issues for our essential workers, which include teachers. What happens there? And I have had some initial conversations with Jason Shear at the Y about how they might be able to help us. But once again, they depend on our spaces. So what space do we have that they could use for providing childcare without mixing kids? And I've also sent the stuff to the BCRD, although I have not had conversations with them at this time about helping with that. But the most critical thing, I think, is trying to get people to start wrapping their minds around the different possibilities and thinking through, what would I do if the school district announces tomorrow my kid can only come to school 2 days a week and the other days they're learning from home? You'll see in the survey that the devices and the connectivity, we did a very good job on that, especially getting all those kids connected that weren't connected. The problem now is, how do you teach that way? How do you help struggling students? And even the students, I don't know if you saw the one graphic where mom is a big word in the middle, and that was a question to the students about who helps them with their work at home. Mom, you know. And so what do you do for the students that don't have mom there because mom's working, you know, or something like that to help them? So that continues to be a piece we're grappling with, is how do we help those students that are struggling to learn, help them from a distance. The focus next year will be on, first of all, social emotional support so that our students can put that trauma aside and be available for learning. And then priority standards in literacy and math, because we do have to continue to introduce new standards and move forward. We can't do like we did this spring and say, we're going to only reinforce what you've already learned. We're not going to move forward. We have to move forward, but how do we pare that down to the most critical pieces? So, and then you'll see some of the next steps is that communicate. And like I said, you should see some pages going up in the next day or two where we'll be asking parents to give us feedback on that and how's it going to work for them. The thing we need the most right now to make this work is bus drivers and bus aides. We just cannot find enough. We're down a couple from even last year. So we're advertising. Brooke is hitting the bushes and trying to find them, but we're really struggling with the bus driver piece. Questions? That was really fast, but.
Dr. Holmes, my understanding is that this has been laid out in terms of options.
Yep.
Which essentially run from a return to distance learning through live classroom, face-to-face instruction.
And every kid there.
Right. Mm-hmm. Do we have an idea, and I know that these conditions are fluid, we can't make a decision right now, but how long can we go before we have to make that decision? Because the comments that I have heard from parents thus far generally are, look, we're going to have to make plans here. We've got to take care of our children. We need childcare. I work. My husband works. I need to know as soon as I can. Is there some realistic response that we can give to those parents?
My hope, and this is based on just my intuition without having a crystal ball, but the Region 4 superintendents do meet every Tuesday virtually as we talk about it. My hope is we will continue to keep the curve flat here in Blaine County, and we will start school with everybody there. So if we can stay flat, we will start school with everybody there. If we do like Twin Falls and some of those southern counties that are now hitting their peak, if we do that at the end of the summer, we will not be starting with everybody there. So the best thing I can say is everybody has to do their part. And I know it's going to be difficult. I keep looking at the CDC website almost every single day. What are they saying about masks? Because I know there's quite a controversy on whether kids should have to wear a mask or not. But I know if we all try to respect each other's fears around this virus and try to respect each other's space so we can keep each other healthy, then we have a much better chance of everybody starting up in the fall. The bigger thing for me that I would say to parents is you need to make plans for all three, because I would say that during the course of next year, somewhere the virus will come roaring back. And when it comes back, we'll either be half of the kids at a time or none of the kids at a time, just like we were this spring. And I know that doesn't help parents because they just want to know, what am I going to do on August 17th? At this point, we're hoping we have every student in school on August 17th, but I would be networking with neighbors and trying to figure out how you're going to work together on this.
Do we consider these plans or these options to be in final form?
Oh, no.
And how soon will they be available then to the parents?
Well, we're putting this up, and this is what they should start thinking about. But in building leadership teams will be meeting again either the last week of July or the first week of August, and we'll take the latest data from the CDC and use that to figure out how we're starting that year. But I'll be revising this. I'll bring it back to you in July with revisions based on any change in what the CDC is saying. So, for example, go back to the mask issue, because that's one I keep watching really close. Initially, the CDC was pretty darn emphatic on the mask, and now they talk about wearing cloth face coverings, and they've even made their language more gentle where they say teach and reinforce the use of cloth face coverings instead of all students shall. So we'll just keep watching it and see where they go.
So if I am a parent of a third grader, God forbid,
Those are really nice people.
I have a third grader next year.
Done that before. He's already been there.
I did my duty. Can I go to the website tomorrow and see at least what options are being discussed?
Yes. Yes. In fact, if you go to the website right now, where's my website? If you scroll down to COVID-19, you will see a little blurb there about some of this kind of stuff already. And then tomorrow or the following day, you should start seeing school reopening pages. I'm getting really tired of that COVID thing, so we're trying to transition to school reopening instead of COVID and bright yellow.
All right. Those are my questions. Other members of the board, Trustee Stone.
I have a couple questions. One of them is, how do you get kids to turn in work if it's not graded? Having just had a senior going through this who actually turned in the vast majority of her work, even though she didn't really have to.
Because you were there?
Because of the way things worked, because she was doing well when she went into this. But I think she was one of the only people that it felt like I was doing that. And we also, so having experienced that from the parent side, she just clearly expressed to me that there's just no motivation when they're not getting graded for stuff. We also got an email from a teacher who said, how can I hold them accountable if they're not turning things in? And if they're not getting graded, they're not going to be motivated to turn things in. I don't have a way to measure their performance. I know the other side of that is there's some kids who get grades for that, and then kids who are unable to complete it and end up or unable to turn it in properly. So I don't know what the answer is on it, but I saw the lack of motivation for kids to turn stuff in if the grade didn't matter, and I'm curious how you're going to address that, because I think teachers get put in a really hard spot if there isn't any accountability.
You'll see in the plan there's some guidance on grading, one of the things, and we do expect to give grades this coming year because we do expect to be introducing new standards and kids mastering it. We also, and I think if you looked at the comments I sent you from the Equity Task Force at Wood River High School, you'll see a lot of the teachers, as they've learned more about equity, have changed their grading, and so what we're recommending based on that is that at the beginning of a unit, if I say to a student, okay, so at the end of this unit, you should be able to solve an equation with two variables, and here's how you're going to prove to me that you can do it, then the student knows from the very beginning what they have to do. So if the student does not do every practice page, but still demonstrates at the end that they've mastered it, then they get a good grade. If they don't do every practice page and demonstrates at the end that they have not mastered it, they have to go back and redo. And it helps them realize, well, there's a reason why those teachers gave us practice pages to do or practice assignments type of thing. But we are really working hard on trying to find the balance between penalizing kids that don't have a parent at home to help them and also saying we have to move forward. We cannot go a whole school year without moving forward on what you're learning. So how are we going to do that?
And part of what the high school is doing, it's my understanding in the middle school, is they're talking about flipping the classroom. Flipping the classroom. So that the homework that you're doing is not at home with mom or whomever else is there, but the homework you're doing is actually in class with the teacher. Right. So that's a big difference too.
If you saw those comments from the teachers, you'll see a lot of them no longer give zeros. They say it's incomplete. Go back and try again, instead of giving you a zero and making you feel like you're just it's impossible for you to do. So, and actually, we're going to lean on a lot of those high school teachers who have been working on that to help their middle school colleagues figure that out as well.
Yeah, right. And then do we have a nurse for each school?
No, we have 3 nurses. That is something that our principals would love to have as a nurse for each school. We would like to have, if we had a couple $1 million, Dan, close your ears. We'd like to have more nurses right now. We'd like to have more teachers so that you could have smaller groups of kids, you know. And of course, then in some of our buildings, we're maxed out, so we don't even have space to put more teachers and kids. But yeah, that's all part of the challenge.
Another question a teacher had was, if I'm teaching in class, this is the AB schedule. Kids are in for 2 days a week. If I'm teaching all day, half the kids, who's helping the kids who are at home with their homework? So are they matched up? Is each teacher matched up with a specials teacher or a parapro or somebody who can be helping kids online at the same time?
A lot of the schools have done that. Some of them will be putting little video clips and, you know, independent work online, that just like they did last spring. So each teacher and school will do it slightly different. But the bigger problem there for me is, all right, so I have a teacher teaching all day and their kids are home on that day, which is why we're having conversations with the Y and hopefully with BCRD about providing some very minimal for nothing but essential, because once again, space is the problem, but for essential workers so that they can do their job. And
what about some other resources as well, like Matt Gershader's camp? I know he had an after school program down in Bellevue. Are there other places that could possibly do that too, to broaden that we can be in communication with about the needs?
I hadn't thought about him. That's a good idea. If he's got scholarship money.
He has in the past. He had a lot of scholarship money. Anyway, I don't know if there's other organizations too.
Yeah, it's pretty expensive otherwise.
Right.
And like I said, we've got space that the Y can do some at Bellevue and at Haley. Of course, the Y is very close to Hemingway, so that's not a problem. We have no space at Alturas, so that's a conundrum. How would we handle that?
Well, and if we had a need like this, it's possible to, I don't know if there are grants or, you know, I don't know at what point you try and facilitate stuff like this. You would know more about that than I do, but to be creative with funding, that would be helpful.
Yeah, to me, it's almost better to be either A or C, but
better to have kids in school at least part-time, right?
Yeah.
Harder for parents to do A and B. Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess some of my concerns with that is, one, Carrie doesn't have a BCRD, a YMCA, anything like that. So I think that's something we really need to consider. And Carrie, when we're doing this, also, I think with option B, I believe it is, you know, these kids that parents aren't home or whatever, you know, and the kids that go on Monday but not Tuesday, and then after school they all get together and play anyway. And so I think that's something that truly we need to consider, you know, or we all go to, you know, Home Depot together or whatever. And so I just don't understand how the AB is going to keep, or, you know, that whatever AB days are going to keep us separated, because really that's not that realistic. I think it either needs to be all in or all out. And I do agree, getting these kids in school is really important, you know, like some is better than none, but at that point, isn't the sum online? And I also agree that, you know, online was awful, you know, like for a mom, I have like 2 teenage boys who was, you know, it was really, especially the moment they learned that they didn't have to do the, you know, and both of my boys have straight A. Porter has some B's, but you know, the second they found out, they're like, I'm out, you know, we're going to go do this. And it was just such a struggle. You can't sit there with your 16-year-old and be like, okay, this is what we're doing today. You know, it's just like bringing things to reality a little bit and how it actually goes. And then also hearing from the teachers that they were just as frustrated, I think, and not all of them, I haven't spoke with all of them, but just as frustrated in that process of how do we engage these kids? How do we want them to show up for themselves? You know? So anyway. Laura?
Yeah, we had one school that that didn't seem to be a big problem with it, but it also happens to be the school where we have the most parents at home, you know.
Yeah.
And so that was very difficult for the ones that didn't have parents. And to me, it's a push-pull between the education and the health.
Yeah. And I got to be home, just saying that, you know, I was home. Great. I'm so grateful that I was, but I do worry about so many that parents didn't get to be home, no matter the age of the child.
Yes, Trustee Stone.
Actually, you know what? I think Dan hasn't had a chance to talk yet. I can go after him.
You know, obviously, we're in the midst of a great experiment here, and my hope is that we have access to the resources that will drive best practices at all times. I mean, there's a whole nation, there's a whole world that's going through this at this point. And do you, Dr. Holmes, feel that we have access to the very best that's going on everywhere, and we can bring that into our community?
We certainly have access to the knowledge and I mean, goodness, look how our community stood up and got our kids connected who were not connected. I don't know of another school district that can say that. I mean, I know the state board the other day was talking about having connectivity in certain spots in the community where the kids could go. And I thought, well, then you're defeating the point of trying to keep people separate. The piece that bothers me is we know that one of the most effective pieces of instruction is student dialogue, conversation, working together, that cooperative learning type of thing. And how do you, and I mean, I was awake in the middle of the night last night trying to figure out how to do this because we keep trying to experiment with ourselves as adults first. How do I have two first graders partner talk with each other when they're 6 feet apart and wearing a mask, you know? So that goes back to that push-pull between the physical health and the educational and emotional health of how do I best serve these kids? And that's why I say we have to make decisions with South Central Public Health and with the county commissioners and stuff, because if you just left it up to me, I'd say everybody in school, we got to get this gap closed.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Well, let's not leave it entirely up to you then.
No, I think we got to do it together as a team, because you got to check my instinct for just saying, oh my gosh, we cannot miss school.
Just kidding. Any other questions on this issue?
I just wanted to, comment that I agree that the best place for our kids to be is in school, and seeing how we as a county have rallied together in the past 2.5 months and really saved ourselves from a disaster situation by, staying at home. I really have even higher hopes for, when August comes. And so I know we are really controlled by what CDC and what the South Central District Health says about our students and what we should be doing with our schools and throughout the district. I'm optimistic, and I think the best thing we can do for our public is tell them to prepare for the worst, but hope for the best. Be prepared just in case your kids won't be at school. You don't want that situation to be, to happen, but be prepared for it. Find somebody for childcare if you need childcare. Team up with your neighbors. We can work I think a lot of this is going to be coming together as a community and trying to figure out what we can do for each other and helping out each other. So, if teachers have students or have children that, they're teaching, but their children are at home, maybe we can find ways to assist those teachers. So I think that a lot of this will, work itself out as we get closer to the date school starts. But I'm thinking that, if we rally together for these past 2 months, I think we can do it again throughout the summer.
We just have to keep on top of it. We cannot let the spread come back.
Have you considered using that company Thought Exchange to get feedback from either staff on what's proposed or from parents?
Yes,
It's free.
Heather looked
It's
at
free
that.
if it's COVID related.
Heather looked at it. It's $25,000.
It's free if it's COVID related. Right now, it's free. Any COVID related thought exchange that you want, and they're doing for free.
Okay, well, she was looking at it for the year. So
They've got a promo. They've got a promo right now, and they're doing free COVID ones. And only takes an hour to set it up. They actually set it up for you. So, think about.
Is this something we could possibly get funding through the foundation for, or find a community partner for funding? It seems like the community's, certainly come forward in the recent past, and I would expect if something, something that could be such an asset for us could be explained in a way that we could maybe bring in some outside funding.
what is this? I'm lost in the conversation.
Thought exchange. Something that helps with our community outreach, two-way communication, being able to process the information better than.
I would ask. I would want to ask for additional funds because the stuff we have right now is specifically for connectivity.
Mm-hmm.
As I keep telling Brian, I want to make sure we do exactly what we're supposed to do because I want more for other projects. I don't want to be saying, oh, well, we can use it over here too.
Well, and that one donor was for the grant that you said, but they have had two other donors who have offered funds that were separate from the grant that are just, last I heard, they were just sitting there for connectivity.
The Heinz Foundation is specific for connectivity.
Yeah.
And so is the Silver Foundation. So I would want to go back and talk to the donors first before I did anything else with them.
For sure. Okay.
All right. It's 10:07. We are 7 minutes over the limit. And there are a couple of policies that do need to be taken up. But Madam Clerk, are you still with us?
Yes, I am.
Would you put policy 502.15, threat assessment, 562, communicable diseases, and the Silver Creek High School graduation requirements on the information agenda for the meeting next Thursday?
Yes, I will.
We should have time to get to those. They're not terribly time consuming, but I'm going to stay as close to my rule as possible. And I'm 8 minutes in violation right now. So I'll entertain that. I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
Do we have executive session right now or not?
No. And go ahead, Dr. Holmes. We didn't mention that.
We're hoping we would have some information from our attorney to review. And late this afternoon, he informed Brian that they're still waiting for it back from the other party.
Okay.
All right. So I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
I'm moving adjourn.
Second that.
Moved and seconded. Any discussion?
Heck no.
None. I'll call a question. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Bye.
Thank you all very much. We will see you again next Thursday, and hopefully we can get the rest of this taken care of at that time.
Great. Thanks,
Good
Dan.
night.
Good to see you.
Good night.
Bye.
You guys.
Bye, guys.
Yay.